The world's jungles hold secrets that few have lived to tell. Explorers, scientists, and adventurers ventured into these untamed forests seeking knowledge, treasure, or glory, yet some never returned, while others emerged forever altered by fever, madness, or terror. Across remote forests from South America to Southeast Asia, expeditions vanished, trails were erased by storms, and the mysteries they encountered continue to baffle historians. Strange illnesses, sudden disappearances, and unexplained events linger in the shadows of these green labyrinths, revealing the peril that comes with human curiosity. Follow the paths where explorers disappeared and uncover the dangers and enigmas the jungle fought to keep hidden. Witness the fates of those who dared to cross into the unknown, from fevered madness to inexplicable vanishings, and discover the relentless grip of the forest on all who enter. The Vanishing of Colonel Percy Fawcett. In the early years of the 20th century, when much of the world had already been mapped and claimed, there remained places that resisted the explorer's hand. Deep in the heart of South America, the Brazilian jungle spread outward in every direction, a world of green labyrinths and rivers that could swallow whole expeditions without a trace. It was here that Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett, a decorated British officer and seasoned explorer, believed an ancient city of immense importance lay hidden beneath the trees. He called it simply Z. The name carried an air of finality, as if it marked not just the end of a journey, but the end of reason itself. Fawcett's fascination began after studying fragments of Portuguese documents and artifacts that hinted at lost civilizations buried within the Mato Grosso region of Brazil. He imagined towering stone structures overgrown by vines, inscriptions written in an unknown language, and treasures untouched by time. What began as curiosity grew into conviction, and conviction soon hardened into obsession. His earlier expeditions had tested him beyond endurance, yet the jungle's cruelty seemed only to deepen his resolve. He was convinced that Z existed, and that he had been chosen to find it. Those who met him in London before his final departure in 1925 described a man consumed by his mission. His eyes burned with a distant purpose that unsettled even his closest friends. Despite warnings from fellow explorers who had seen the jungle devour men stronger than him, Fawcett dismissed their doubts with a calm certainty. He believed that belief itself was protection, that purity of purpose could shield him from the dangers that awaited. To his wife, Nina, he wrote of glory and discovery, promising to return with proof of a lost world. But the letters would stop and the jungle would keep its silence. He was not alone in his quest. Accompanying him were his eldest son, Jack Fawcett, and Jack's close friend, Raleigh Rimmel. Both were young, idealistic, and captivated by the promise of adventure. Together, they ventured west from Cuiabá, carrying little more than basic supplies, rifles, notebooks, and Fawcett's unshakable faith. Their small party was guided by native porters familiar with the region's rivers and terrain, but even they expressed unease as the group moved deeper into the forest. The air thickened with humidity, and every step forward felt as though the jungle was swallowing the path behind them. Days bled into weeks as the expedition pressed onward through choking undergrowth, swarms of insects, and the constant threat of fever. The men's clothes rotted on their backs, and food supplies dwindled faster than anticipated. Still, Fawcett pushed on, convinced that signs of ancient habitation lay just beyond the next ridge. His journals from previous journeys revealed a man who saw omens in the landscape, patterns where others saw chaos. He believed the forest spoke to those willing to listen, and that within its whispers was the promise of Zed. The last confirmed sighting of the expedition came from a camp along the upper Xingu River. Local tribes watched them pass by and later described their leader as calm, even radiant, despite exhaustion. Fawcett's final letter, sent back with 2 departing porters, reported that the group was in good health and expected to reach the goal soon. After that, the trail went cold. The jungle closed its curtain of leaves, and no voice answered from within. When months passed with no word, concern turned to alarm. Rescue missions were mounted, some by experienced explorers, others by adventurers drawn by the growing legend of the lost colonel. None found a trace. Some searchers vanished, others returned with tales of hostile tribes, skeletal remains, and strange artifacts that only deepened the mystery. Over the years, stories multiplied. Some claimed Fawcett had been killed by local tribesmen, others insisted he had found his city and chosen to stay. A few believed he had gone mad, consumed by the dream he chased until he became part of it. Natives in the region later spoke of a white-bearded man who had lived among them, teaching strange rituals before disappearing again into the forest. Yet none of these claims could be proven, and each retelling shifted the truth further from reach. Even Fawcett's compass, a simple instrument meant to measure direction, became an object of rumour when one identical to his surfaced decades later, rusted and worn. Whether it truly belonged to him or another lost traveller was never established. Fawcett's wife continued to believe her husband was alive long after the world declared him dead. She imagined him ruling over the remnants of an ancient people too enlightened or too transformed to return. Their surviving son spent years organising expeditions to find him, but none succeeded. Each journey seemed to end where the last had, swallowed by the same green silence. Time turned Fawcett from explorer to legend, from man to myth, and yet the question of what happened to him remained suspended between fact and faith. Modern investigations have tried to solve the riddle through science, not stories. Skeletal remains once believed to be his were examined and dismissed as belonging to another. Archaeologists have uncovered ruins in regions Fawcett once described, but none have matched his accounts of a city untouched by time. Historians suggest he underestimated the jungle's vastness and overestimated his endurance. Psychologists point to obsession, isolation, and the slow mental decay that afflicts those who believe the wilderness speaks directly to them. Yet even in analysis, the mystery resists closure. The Brazilian jungle remains as merciless as when Fawcett entered it, its rivers winding through landscapes where the air itself feels ancient. Expeditions still vanish there, though fewer now tempt fate as he once did. The story of the colonel endures not because of what he found, but because of what he sought, the line between discovery and delusion, between faith and madness. His name is spoken like a warning among explorers who step into places untouched by light, a reminder that some paths once taken do not lead back. And somewhere beyond the last known trail, where maps blur into green, the jungle keeps what it took, patient and silent, as though guarding the truth that no one will ever see. The obsession that consumed the city of Ze. Some minds are not broken by the jungle. They are built from it. Within such minds, the chaos of nature finds its echo, the green immensity of the forest taking shape as thought, conviction, and finally belief. Colonel Percy Fawcett's mind was not conquered by the Amazon. It was constructed in its image, expanding without end, filled with darkness and glimmers of impossible light. What he sought in the jungle was not a city of stone, but the reflection of a vision that had already taken root inside him. Long before he vanished, Fawcett's thoughts had already disappeared into the idea of Ze. In London's Royal Geographical Society, while others debated maps and measured distances, he spoke of something older than the rivers themselves, a civilization lost not through war or time, but through deliberate concealment. He described its existence with the same certainty as he described the turn of a river or the height of a mountain, yet there was nothing solid to hold on to, only whispers, old reports, and a growing certainty that the world had forgotten something monumental. The earliest spark came from brittle Portuguese manuscripts found in Rio de Janeiro, the writings of a colonial official who claimed to have seen stone walls deep in the wilderness. The document spoke of temples, hieroglyphs, and a city so vast it defied imagination. Most historians dismissed it as myth, the sort of grand invention common to early explorers. But Fawcett was different. To him, those words were not relics of delusion, they were evidence, glimpses of a truth hidden beneath centuries of disbelief. Within those faded lines, he saw more than records. He saw prophecy. The idea of Z was no longer confined to paper. It began to shape his dreams, his waking thoughts, his entire sense of purpose. He pored over maps until the rivers blurred together, tracing routes no one had travelled, inventing pathways through the wilderness where none had been recorded. The jungle for him became both labyrinth and promise. Its danger was proof of its sanctity, its remoteness confirmation that something extraordinary waits within. As his conviction deepened, reason became a hindrance rather than a guide. He began to speak less like a cartographer and more like a disciple. The lines between faith and exploration grew thin. He wrote of unseen energies pulsing through the forest, of a civilization more spiritually advanced than the modern world. Colleagues noticed the shift but dismissed it as harmless eccentricity. They did not see that obsession has no boundary, that it feeds quietly until it consumes everything else. Those closest to him began to sense the change. His wife, Nina, received letters filled with grand declarations of destiny and sacrifice. His children listened as he described the jungle not as a threat, but as a sacred proving ground. Friends watched his reputation among scholars crumble, for few could take seriously a man who spoke of ancient enlightenment hidden beneath vines. Yet Fawcett did not waver. Doubt from others only confirmed his belief that he alone was meant to find Z. His letters, once measured and practical, began to read like scripture. In one, he spoke of a great white god ruling over a city of shining towers. In another, he promised that the discovery would rewrite all knowledge of humanity's beginnings. The tone was no longer that of a scientist reporting findings, but of a prophet proclaiming revelation. Each word pressed further away from the rational world he had once served. The man who once charted frontiers with precision was now mapping the landscape of his own conviction. By the final years before departure, the man who sought a city seemed to be chasing revelation. His contemporaries noted that he moved through London as though half absent, his eyes fixed on distances no one else could see. He sold his possessions, studied indigenous law, and grew restless in every place that was not the jungle. To Fawcett, civilization had become suffocating, and the wilderness was the only truth left. He believed he would not merely find Z, but that it would find him, that its hidden intelligence waited for a mind willing to understand. To many, Z was an imaginary ruin, a dream born of heat and hunger, the kind of fantasy that lures explorers to ruin. Yet, dreams, once believed in strongly enough, acquire gravity of their own. Fawcett's conviction drew others toward him, men eager to join, to prove, to share in the glory. They saw in his certainty a strange kind of power, as though he were illuminated by some private revelation. And when he spoke of the jungle, even skeptics felt for a moment that he might be right. To Fawcett, it was the answer to every question the modern world could not satisfy. Where others saw the jungle as chaos, he saw design. Where others saw danger, he saw invitation. He wrote that humanity had lost its path in the noise of machines and empires, and that Z represented a purer age, untouched by greed or decay. The expedition was not simply a search, it was a pilgrimage, a test of faith disguised as exploration. The deeper his devotion grew, the less he seemed to belong to the ordinary world. Even in his absence, his obsession spread, infecting those who tried to follow. Expedition after expedition set out to retrace his steps, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had driven him. Some vanished, others turned back, claiming that the jungle itself seemed to resist them. What Fawcett had believed to be calling him now repelled all others. It was as though the idea of Zer, once born, had gained a will of its own, guarding its secret, claiming new victims to preserve its silence. The jungle has a way of preserving what should have died, ideas most of all. Fawcett's dream remains alive in whispers, in half-forgotten journals, in the faded ink of his maps. Decades later, explorers still speak of uncharted ruins glimpsed from the air, of impossible geometries hidden beneath the trees. Science explains, then doubts, then circles back again, for the allure of Z refuses to fade. It has become part of the forest's mythic architecture, a mirage that endures because belief itself refuses to surrender. And though the man who first named it vanished into that endless green, the city he imagined endures, not in stone or soil, but in the minds of those who cannot stop searching for what was never meant to be found. Raymond Maufrais and the French Guiana disappearance. There are dreams born in solitude, burning too brightly to survive the world that awaits them. Raymond Maufrais's dream began in the quiet rooms of his childhood in Toulon, where maps of South America hung like promises on the walls. He read of lost cities and forgotten tribes, of explorers who vanished into jungles that seemed alive. By his mid-20s, the notion of a blank space on the map had become irresistible. He wanted to prove that the Amazon still held secrets untouched by modern hands, and that he could uncover them alone. In 1949, Maufrais left the port of Cayenne with a rucksack, a camera, and an impossible goal. He had no formal training in survival, no experience navigating tropical rivers, and yet his ambition was absolute. He told his parents he was heading toward the Tumac-Humac Mountains, an area few Europeans had ever seen, where legends spoke of undiscovered tribes and hidden plateaus. He promised to write when he reached them, but the letters stopped before he even crossed the first range. The jungle had begun its quiet work. The interior of French Guiana stretched before him, uncharted and nearly impenetrable, a wall of green heat and silence. Each day began under the cry of unseen birds and ended beneath storms that seemed to fall without warning. Paths vanished overnight beneath vines, and rivers swelled into barriers that dragged away anything that entered them. The world around him no longer moved in directions he could measure. Even the sun, dulled by mist, lost its place in the sky. He wrote of beauty first, of the rivers that flashed like metal under the sun, and the songs of unseen birds echoing across the canopy. His early journal pages carried the tone of wonder, a poet's fascination with the wilderness he longed to understand. He described fish that glowed beneath the surface, monkeys that followed his movements from tree to tree, and nights so loud with life that sleep became impossible. Yet even amid admiration, there was the creeping sense that the forest was not a setting but a presence, one that watched him as carefully as he observed it. But as the days passed and his provision thinned, the language of his journal began to falter. His sentences shortened, drifting from description into fragments of survival, hunger, thirst, cold, river. He mentioned losing his compass after a fall, and later his matches were soaked by rain. Food ran out and the villages he expected to find did not exist. In one entry he admitted he had eaten a handful of seeds that made him ill for days. Still, he refused to turn back, writing that his mission must continue, that he was closer than ever. The forest grew louder, its rhythms less like nature and more like a pulse. Maufrais began recording the sounds that haunted his nights. Footsteps, he claimed, that never revealed a source. He heard drums in the distance, faint but rhythmic, and once wrote that someone had called his name from within the dark. There were no people for miles, yet he described feeling observed at every moment. His tone shifted from exploration to confession, as if the act of writing kept him tethered to reason. By the third week his handwriting changed, smaller, erratic, as if the words themselves were struggling to escape. He described intense heat, dizziness, and a sense that the forest itself was closing around him. His entries grew feverish, referring to invisible watchers and a trail that moved while I slept. On the final pages, the ink runs thin and the words blur together. "If I die," he wrote, "I want to be known as someone who believed in something impossible." When he stopped writing dates altogether, only the fragments remained: hunger, fever, the sound of water nearby. His last notes spoke of exhaustion and of waiting, though for what he did not say. There were no farewells, no signs of panic, no. Only the fading voice of a man who could no longer distinguish discovery from delirium. After that, silence. The rest of the pages were blank. Months later, a search party found his camp abandoned, the fire pit cold, his journal sealed in a tin box beside untouched film. The rucksack was still there, along with a few cans of food too rusted to open. There was no body, no footprints, no trail. Searchers combed the rivers and airstrips for weeks but found nothing beyond that small clearing. It was as if Maufrais had walked into the trees and dissolved. In the years that followed, more expeditions were launched to retrace his steps. His father, Edgar Maufrais, devoted the rest of his life to finding him, scouring the jungles of Guyana for 15 years. He discovered villages that had never seen outsiders and collected dozens of rumours, stories of a white man living alone in the interior, of bones found near an old path, of a figure seen crossing a river long after Raymond should have perished. None could be verified. Each rumour only deepened the mystery. The journal became his only true legacy, a document of courage and obsession. Its pages have since been studied by explorers, linguists and psychologists alike, each reading in them a different meaning. Some see the record of an idealist crushed by the indifference of nature. Others believe it reveals the first stages of jungle-induced psychosis. Yet the most haunting interpretation is that Maufrais finally found what he was searching for, and that what he found could not be brought back. Even now, deep within the wilderness of French Guiana, the name Maufrais lingers among the people who live along the rivers. Hunters claim the forest grows unusually still in the area where his camp once stood. Travellers sometimes leave offerings, a matchbox, a scrap of paper, a coin, as if the act might calm a restless spirit. In the archives of Cayenne, his tin box remains on display, its surface tarnished by years of damp air, its contents sealed like a message from someone who never meant to return. What became of him remains hidden where the forest swallows even memory itself. Tatunka, Nara, and the Jungle of Lies. It began with a rumour carried downriver, a whisper of stone cities buried beneath the green heart of the Amazon. Traders spoke of an ancient people who vanished underground before the first Europeans ever saw the river's mouth. They described steps descending into the earth, tunnels lined with carvings, and walls that gleamed in torchlight. No one had seen it themselves, but every village had someone who swore they knew someone who had. The name of the lost city was Akakor, and in the years that followed it spread across continents like a secret too powerful to stay hidden. In the towns along the riverbanks, the story changed with each retelling. Sometimes ancient tunnels, sometimes gods who lived underground. It became part of the jungle's living memory, reshaped by every voice that carried it. Missionaries heard of it from tribes who had never met. Explorers plotted its supposed coordinates on maps, and local guides used the name to lure those who arrived with notebooks and cameras. What none could explain was how the same legend seemed to drift from one end of the Amazon to the other, as though the forest itself was speaking through them. By the time the tale reached Europe, it had become an obsession, a promise of lost civilizations waiting to be found. Newspapers printed sketches of temples swallowed by vines, and fringe researchers claimed the legend proved ancient contact between humans and beings from the stars. The idea of Akakor arrived at the perfect time, when the world was losing its mysteries to satellites and science. It offered something untouched, a place that still resisted explanation. Expeditions were planned, funds gathered, and the jungle once again became a stage for faith disguised as discovery. Among those drawn to the mystery were journalists, soldiers, and amateur archaeologists who believed Akakor could rewrite human history. The forest, dense and indifferent, accepted them all. Many returned days later, exhausted and bitten, swearing they had heard distant drums. Others never came back at all. Still, the myth endured because belief needs only the silence of the missing to grow stronger. Out of this fever of belief stepped a man who called himself Tatunka Nara. He appeared in the 1970s in the Brazilian border region, tall, dark-haired, and dressed in the attire of an Amazonian chieftain. His Portuguese was broken, his story rehearsed. He claimed to be the son of a white father and an indigenous mother, the last surviving chief of an underground nation that guarded the ruins of Akakor. To those who listened, he spoke with the calm authority of someone who had seen what others only imagined. To some, he was a guide, a prophet, a living link to the secrets of the interior. To others, a fraud born from the hunger for wonder. He told journalists that Akakor was not a myth, but a truth hidden beneath miles of stone and root, where the gods of the first time had built cities with light. He carried no proof, yet his confidence was unshakable. He offered to lead expeditions through the rainforest to where he said the tunnels began, deep in the borderlands between Brazil, Peru, and Colombia. Each journey would end in confusion, delay, or disappearance, and still more followed. The most famous among them was Karl Brugger, a German reporter who recorded hours of Tatunka's stories and later published them in a book titled The Chronicle of Akakor. Brugger's account transformed Tatunka from a local curiosity into an international mystery. Readers debated whether he was a hoax or a prophet, but few could ignore the strange precision of his words, dates, names, and events that wove myth into something resembling history. Even scientists began asking whether fragments of truth might be hidden within the lies. The deeper his followers went, the fewer of them returned. In 1980, the American explorer John Reed disappeared while seeking Akakor under Tatunka's guidance. 3 years later, the Swiss woman Christine Heuser vanished in the same region, reportedly after travelling with him. Then came the case of Herbert Wanner, another European adventurer whose body was never recovered. Each case was marked by confusion, contradictory reports, lost records, and Tatunka's insistence that they had left the expedition alive. The forest gave no answers, and without bodies there were no crimes. Local authorities grew suspicious, but the evidence was always scattered, the truth wrapped in jungle silence. Some said Tatunka lived among the tribes of the upper Rio Negro, vanishing into the forest whenever questions grew too close. Others believed he used the jungle's vastness as protection, guiding new believers through territory he knew better than anyone. He seemed to exist in two forms: the man who spoke to journalists and the shadow who slipped away into the green whenever someone tried to find him again. When journalists traced his name to a missing German fugitive, the story only deepened, because no one could agree who he truly was. Records in Germany revealed a man named Gunther Hauck, who had vanished in the 1960s after a series of small crimes. The photograph matched, so did the accent. When confronted, Tatunka smiled and denied everything. "The white man you speak of is dead," he said. "I am Tatunka Nara." To those who had lost friends in the jungle, it felt like a mockery. To others, it was proof that he had become his own creation. Even so, in the towns that border the Amazon, his legend endures, a ghost story disguised as a man's life. People still claim to have met him years after he should have aged beyond recognition, guiding tourists through smaller expeditions, always promising a path toward the city below. Some swear his stories grow more elaborate each time, shaped by whatever the listener most wants to hear. Others say they've seen him sitting alone at river docks, staring into the jungle as if waiting for a sign. Researchers who revisit the case describe it not as fraud, but as something stranger, a kind of living myth that turned lies into events, words into consequences. The deaths of Brugger, Reed and others remain unsolved, tied forever to the stories of Akakor. Each retelling adds another layer, another uncertainty, another question about whether Tatunka's deception was deliberate, or if he had come to believe the fiction himself. The boundary between belief and delusion dissolved somewhere along the river, and once again the jungle swallowed the truth. Those who knew him say he once spoke of an entrance that could only be seen at dusk, when the shadows of the trees aligned with the hills. Others recall that he warned his companions never to look back once they crossed a certain stream. Whether these were remnants of myth or confessions disguised as stories, no one could ever tell. Deep within the Amazon, near the caves he once described, the jungle seems to wait for the next believer to follow his voice into the dark. The fatal route of the Pan American expedition. They called it a journey of unity, born from the belief that two continents could be bridged by courage and endurance alone. The Pan American expedition was meant to be the defining adventure of its era, a trek through the last untouched wilderness between the Americas, an unbroken path from Colombia to Panama through the thickest jungle on Earth. Newspapers called it a symbol of progress, a trail that would one day become the spine of the hemisphere. But as the men and women who set out discovered, the Darien Gap was not a passage. It was a labyrinth that swallowed even the most prepared, and it did not give them back unchanged. The rainforest met them like a wall of sound, its humidity pressing against the lungs and coating their skin with a film that never dried. Every movement brought the hiss of insects, the rustle of unseen wings, and the constant chorus of creatures hidden just out of view. The team included explorers, engineers, and soldiers from several nations, each bringing their own purpose. For some, it was scientific glory. For others, patriotism. For the rest, the thrill of being first. They cut into the green curtain with machetes, marking progress in feet rather than miles, never realizing that the jungle was closing behind them as fast as they advanced. Days bled into weeks, the world reduced to shades of green and brown and the relentless pulse of heat. Their boots rotted, their rations moulded, and the maps drawn in camp flickered into meaninglessness by morning. Rivers shifted overnight, trails vanished, and the insects learned the taste of their blood. They began to burn letters from home to keep them dry, each flame a small defiance against the endless moisture. Still, morale held, for a while. The expedition leader, an American engineer named Garrett, kept them moving with the promise that the clearing ahead would reveal open sky, that they were close to breaking through the final barrier between two worlds. But there was no end to the trees, only deeper silence. When the first man fell ill, they believed it was only fever, another inescapable part of jungle life. But the sickness spread like a rumour, moving from tent to tent, each victim shivering beneath soaked blankets while the air outside burned with heat. Garrett ordered the sick to be carried on stretchers until they could no longer move, then buried them beneath shallow earth that turned to mud with the next rain. He noted each name in his journal until the ink ran, the entries shorter each day, words dissolving into smudges that looked more like scratches than sentences. Maps turned to pulp in the rain and tempers followed. The men blamed the guides blamed the compasses. Some swore they saw lights moving between the trees at night, torches too steady to be reflections of fireflies. Others claimed to hear distant drums that stopped when they listened too closely. There were footprints in the mud that matched no one in the group, bare, narrow, and deep. Garrett dismissed them as illusions, tricks of exhaustion, but he began to sleep with his rifle beside him. Something shifted in their faces, a quiet exhaustion that no rest could mend. The expedition doctor wrote that the fever seemed to change its victims even after recovery. Some wandered off at dawn without taking their gear, as if called away by something in the forest. A Peruvian cartographer was found standing waist-deep in a swamp, staring at nothing, his skin pale beneath the insects. When questioned, he said the jungle was breathing, that it was counting them, waiting. Garrett struck the line from the report, but others began to whisper it too. Among the scattered journals recovered months later, one entry stood out, a hurried note written by one of the engineers describing a strange stretch of flooded forest, where the compass spun without direction and the air seemed to hum faintly as if charged. He mentioned seeing flickers of light moving between the trees at night, reflections that did not match their campfires. The handwriting grew erratic by the final page. The ink smudged as though written in the rain, ending abruptly mid-sentence as if interrupted. Investigators could never confirm the location he described, and no further mention of it appeared in any of the others' notes. By the time the radio failed, the jungle had already taken command. They had been sending distorted messages for days, crackling bursts of static mixed with phrases that made no sense. The last clear transmission spoke of circles in the trees and voices behind the rain. Rescue parties were organised months later, but the region was too vast, too unforgiving. Those who tried to follow the route turned back with stories of sudden storms and rotted bridges, of tents found long abandoned, everything inside covered with mould as if years had passed in weeks. The survivors' accounts never aligned. One man claimed they were attacked by locals who vanished as suddenly as they appeared. Another spoke of infighting and sabotage, of men driven mad by the isolation. A third insisted the forest itself moved, that they would wake to find their paths gone, the ground rearranged. Only 3 people ever walked out, and none could say with certainty how many had died. Garrett was not among them. His journal was later discovered half buried near a riverbank, its final pages smeared and unreadable, except for a single phrase written over and over, "Not a road, never a road." Years later, when fragments of equipment were uncovered along the Pan American Highway's construction route, the site matched the last known coordinates of Garrett's camp. Engineers found boots fused to roots, rifles rusted into the earth, and a compass whose needles spun endlessly without stopping. Local workers refused to continue digging, claiming they could hear whispers in the clearing at night. Officials dismissed it as superstition, though the site was quietly sealed and rerouted around without explanation. What the forest kept, no one has dared to ask for again. The Burmese Ruby Quest. Whispers of redstone travelled far beyond the borders of Burma, carrying tales of a valley where the earth bled crimson beneath the pickaxe. Mogok, they called it, the Valley of Rubies, hidden deep within the jungle where the mountains fold into mist. For centuries it drew kings and conquerors alike, each seeking the stones said to hold the fire of the sun itself. When the 20th century dawned, the legend grew into an obsession, and a small European-led expedition set out to find a new deposit rumoured to outshine them all. They spoke of wealth beyond empires, but none of them spoke again once they entered the green labyrinth that guarded it. Caravans arrived like a fever, crawling through the narrow passes, burdened with crates of tools, rifles and quinine. The air grew thicker as they advanced, the canopy pressing down until daylight fractured into flecks of gold between the leaves. The expedition's leader, a geologist named Ernst Vollen, believed he could map the hidden veins of ruby beneath the forest floor by studying the colour of the streams. He charted every bend of the river, marking where the water ran faintly red, dismissing the warnings of local miners who refused to follow him beyond the old quarries. They told him the forest was not empty, that beyond a certain ridge, the ground itself protested when struck. Vollen laughed, calling it folklore, but even his laughter seemed swallowed before it reached the trees. In the valleys where mist clings to the canopy, the sound of their digging seemed to echo back as if something beneath were answering. The soil grew dense with clay, the air rank with rot. The men sweated through their clothes by midday, their bodies trembling not from exertion but from a mounting sense that they were being watched. Night brought no relief. Fires sputtered against the wet air, and shadows moved where no wind passed. The local guide set charms along the perimeter of camp, small woven talismans meant to appease the spirits of the hills. By morning, half were gone, buried in the mud or torn apart by unseen hands. Superstition thrived where maps failed. The guides began to argue in whispers, claiming the rubies were guarded by the gnats, the spirits of the dead who had died in greed. Vollen scrawled the word superstitio in his notebook beside every warning, but his handwriting grew uneven, the lines trailing into jagged marks. He grew irritable, snapping at his assistants, his eyes sunken and fevered. One evening, a miner returned from the shafts carrying a stone so dark it seemed almost black. When it was held to the firelight, it pulsed faintly as if alive. The next day, that miner was gone. His tools lay in the dirt, his boots still damp and his tent untouched. Deep inside the excavation tunnels, the air turned heavy with the smell of sulphur and decay. Candles flickered against slick walls, revealing veins that shimmered faintly before disappearing into shadow. The men began to hear faint tapping from somewhere beyond the rock, rhythmic and deliberate, though no one was working that deep. They dug toward the sound until the passage split, the walls narrowing to a point where they had to crawl. When one man squeezed through, the others heard him shout, then nothing. They called his name until their throats ached, but the tapping did not stop. It continued for hours, slower now, as if coming from farther away. By the time the rains came, the expedition's journals had turned to pulp. The deluge blurred days into nights, flooding the tunnels and swallowing their equipment. The survivors dragged what they could onto higher ground, building makeshift shelters under dripping tarps. Fever broke through the camp like fire. Vollen, half delirious, insisted they were close, that he could feel the rubies beneath them, that the earth was resisting because they were near the heart of it. He stopped sleeping, sitting for hours in the rain with his hands in the mud, muttering measurements that made no sense. When his assistants tried to pull him away, he struck one with a compass, shouting that the forest was aligning itself against them. Miners began disappearing without sound or struggle. One morning, 3 tents stood empty, their ropes still tied, the ground undisturbed. Footprints led into the undergrowth and stopped after only a few paces. The men left behind spoke of hearing singing in the night, low and rhythmic, carried on the wind. They swore they saw figures among the trees, barefoot, moving without sound, their skin faintly glowing in the dark. When they fired their rifles, the forest fell silent, but when they reloaded, the singing began again, closer this time. Those left alive refused to meet one another's eyes. No one spoke Vollen's name anymore, though his tent still stood zipped shut, its canvas slick with rain. A strange smell drifted from inside, sweet and metallic, but no one dared open it. The assistant who finally did run, screaming into the forest, and was never seen again. The others packed what they could and began to retreat, following the river downstream until it split into unfamiliar branches. The jungle seemed to shift as they moved, turning them in circles. They found their own footprints days later and realized they had been walking back toward the mine. Officials who later inspected the site found little more than rusted tools, flooded shafts, and bones half buried in red clay. One journal, miraculously preserved in an oilskin pouch, contained only a few legible lines, measurements, mineral readings, and a final note: the stone is watching. To this day, the locals avoid the ridge above Magok where the expedition vanished. Travellers speak of faint red light glowing through the fog on certain nights, pulsing like embers deep beneath the soil. Some claim it is only the reflection of lanterns from the mines below. Others say it is the heart of the jungle still guarding what was never meant to be found. The earth remembers those who tried to wound it, restless beneath the weight of their greed. The Congo Basin Tragedy. Deep within the equatorial heart of Africa lies a realm of endless green, where light filters through a ceiling of leaves so dense it feels like dusk even at noon. The air moves heavily, saturated with the scent of decay and sap, and beneath it all the ground pulses with unseen life. Rivers curve through the wilderness like veins, carrying silt the colour of rust, and the cries of unseen creatures echo from depths no human has mapped. It was here, in this labyrinth of moisture and shadow, that an expedition sought to trace what cartographers once called the unbroken heart of darkness. What drew the expedition here was not gold or legend, but the pursuit of understanding, a desire to study the uncharted interior, to map the tributaries that vanished into myth. The group was multinational, composed of naturalists, geographers, and soldiers, their supplies packed in wooden crates sealed against the rot. They carried cameras, phonographs, and instruments delicate enough to measure humidity, but nothing to guard against what awaited them beyond the riverbanks. For a time, their optimism endured, their dispatches full of detail and wonder, describing new plant species, towering trees, and luminous insects that appeared at dusk like drifting stars. The first weeks passed under an illusion of control. Trails were cut with precision, and the group advanced a few miles each day, their path marked with white cloth tied to trees. Yet the jungle closed behind them as if stitching itself shut, reclaiming every inch of ground. Rain fell without warning and without end, soaking journals, spoiling film, and softening maps into pulp. Mosquitoes clouded around the camps, and the ceaseless noise of life, the buzzing, screeching, hissing, came a kind of madness that made sleep feel like surrender. Some evenings, a low mist would creep between the trees, carrying with it a smell unlike decay or damp earth, sweet, metallic, and strangely familiar. Lanterns illuminated particles that shimmered in the haze, and those who breathed it swore they heard faint tones like music buried within the air. The expedition's leader ordered samples collected, but the jars later shattered overnight, their glass cracked outward as if from pressure within. It was dismissed as coincidence, yet afterward, a third of the group reported identical dreams of walking in circles, following voices that called their names from just beyond the clearing. Compasses faltered where the canopy thickened, the needles trembling and refusing to settle. The men began to argue over direction, their charts contradicting one another as landmarks shifted or disappeared entirely. Paths they swore they had walked the day before led to waterlogged clearings or sudden swamps. The Congo Basin, vast and unmapped, seemed to turn upon itself, its rivers looping and dividing, guiding travellers in endless circles. It was said that even the native guides, born within the forest edge, grew uncertain, muttering of places where no bird dared fly and no echo returned. Illness came next, silent and unrelenting. Fevers rose without pattern, and rations rotted before this could be consumed. The air thickened with the smell of mildew and infection, and the expedition's medical supplies dissolved into uselessness. Some of the afflicted wandered off into the trees, delirious and untraceable, their voices fading into the constant hum of the forest. Others refused to speak, sitting motionless at the edge of camp, eyes fixed on nothing. What journals survived describe moments of lucidity punctuated by dread, entries noting movement in the trees, distant lights, and whispers that no one could locate. Among the scattered journals recovered years later, the handwriting grows uneven, sentences half finished, ink smeared by rain. One entry mentions a stone structure glimpsed through the undergrowth, covered in vines but too geometric to be natural. Another refers to drumming heard far into the night, rhythmic but never human. Then the writing stops entirely. The pages that follow are blank except for stains that might be water or something darker. The expedition's final known message, transmitted by a failing radio, contained only a few broken words. River rising, too many, cannot, before static swallowed the rest. Those who attempted the rescue described the forest as alive, as if it breathed and listened. They followed fragments of maps and fading footprints, their torches flickering against walls of foliage so dense that daylight was a rumour. Equipment corroded within days, and the stench of rot clung to every surface. They found remnants of tents collapsed under vines, boxes torn open, and boots half buried in mud. No bodies were ever recovered, though bones of unknown origin were discovered tangled among roots, polished smooth by the damp. Some claimed the ground itself seemed to absorb sound, muting speech into whispers. Later expeditions, decades apart, reported finding fragments of equipment stamped with the same insignia as the vanished team: canteens, a rusted camera lens, and what appeared to be a compass sealed within amber-coloured resin. Each discovery came hundreds of miles from the last known route, suggesting either the river carried their remains farther than believed, or that something had scattered their possessions deliberately. When those objects were brought to the surface world, they emitted a faint odour of mould and oil, and within days the metal corroded as though the forest's breath had followed them home. Every clue retrieved from the site felt incomplete. Photographs developed into pale ghosts, outlines of faces without detail. Instruments seized by the humidity gave readings that made no sense, as though the very atmosphere resisted measurement. The rescue party marked the last known location of the expedition, but returning later even their own coordinates failed to match. The jungle had shifted once more, swallowing its evidence. It was as though the forest refused to allow even memory to linger. Even today, satellite images reveal little more than green oblivion, a vast sprawl of canopy where rivers vanish beneath mist. Historians argue whether the expedition perished by starvation, disease, or something less definable, panic perhaps, or a slow surrender to the endlessness around them. The Congo Basin remains largely unmapped, its depths still capable of hiding what it chooses, its silence as heavy as the heat that never lifts. The Congo keeps its dead, and its silence is deeper than the river itself. The Borneo expedition that went silent. From a sealed crate found in a warehouse near Kuching came the first hint that the Borneo expedition had ever existed. Inside lay several reels of damp film, a corroded radio, and a handful of notebooks whose pages had fused into blocks of pulp. The crate was dated 1972 and labelled only with the expedition's code, B3A. No records matched that number. No sponsors claimed it. No academic body remembered funding it. What little could be deciphered from the documents suggested the group had gone in search of a remote plateau in the heart of Sarowok, an area rumoured to hold both ancient stone formations and species unseen since the Pleistocene. Whatever they found, or thought they found, was never reported. The crate was all that ever came back. In the months before their departure, the team's leader, Dr. Edward Langford, had written confidently of charting one of the last blank spaces on the map. His group included 2 field biologists, a geologist, and a photographer who specialised in aerial surveys. They were joined by local Dayak guides familiar with the river systems, but reluctant to go too deep. Letters sent to the British Museum spoke of a perfectly preserved world, untouched by man or modernity, where the air itself carried an electrical charge. Langford seemed convinced that what lay beyond the Mahakam tributary would redefine both geology and anthropology, a living memory of Earth's ancient past. By the 3rd week of travel, their radio logs grew shorter, replaced by clipped messages about humidity damage and erratic compasses. The jungle canopy thickened until even daylight became a dull green haze. Recordings from their early days captured laughter and the rhythmic chop of machetes. Later ones were silent except for heavy breathing and the faint sound of dripping water. The last transmission came on June 19th, a calm voice stating only that they had reached the markers and would proceed north in the morning. After that, nothing more was heard. Among the recovered film reels, investigators found frames showing figures half hidden by mist, shapes too large to be human, moving parallel to the group. The images were blurred, the emulsion warped by heat and moisture, but one sequence showed the team standing still in a clearing, their attention fixed on something just beyond the lens. The photographer's log noted vibrations in the soil and a low humming that makes speech difficult. Moments later, the footage cut to static. Technicians restoring the reels decades later found that the last few feet of film had been deliberately burned through with a lighter, as though someone wanted to ensure no one would ever see what came next. One section of Langford's journal was written in pencil so faintly that it could only be read under ultraviolet light. He described a sound that vibrated in the bones, not the air, and trees that shuddered without wind. His handwriting grew uneven, slanted downward across the page, as if written in haste. A later entry mentioned that 2 of the guides had refused to continue, claiming they heard footsteps behind them that never came closer. They turned back toward the river and were never seen again. Langford noted their absence only in passing, focusing instead on light columns visible at night between the trees. Local guides who refused to enter the region later claimed that an old warning had been ignored, one that forbade staying past dusk near the confluence of two nameless rivers. They spoke of voices in the current and the smell of iron before rain, both seen as signs that the forest was awake and watching. Anthropologists dismissed these accounts as folklore, relics of animist belief, but one surviving member of the 1973 search effort later admitted he had heard something similar, an intermittent tone that seemed to come from beneath the ground, fading only when they left the area. The rescue party that followed months later found their path marked not by footprints, but by carefully arranged stones forming geometric patterns impossible to explain as chance. The stones were slick with moss yet positioned with precision, spiralling outward from a central point that corresponded to the team's last known coordinates. At the spiral's centre lay a broken compass, its needle jammed in place. The rescuers camped nearby for a single night and left at dawn, unnerved by what one described as the sensation of being measured. Weather records from that season indicated no storms, yet the camp's aluminum canoes were found miles inland, bent and blackened as though scorched. The vegetation around them remained untouched, leaves still glossy and green. Samples were taken and later stored in sealed containers, though no analysis ever appeared in public reports. What few notes survived from that investigation mentioned unusual magnetic readings, fluctuations strong enough to interfere with metal instruments and briefly halt wristwatches. Beyond that, the jungle was silent. Forensic examination of the equipment decades later revealed faint traces of minerals foreign to Borneo, crystalline deposits resembling those found in deep-sea vents rather than tropical soil. Experts speculated that the team may have uncovered a geological anomaly, a pocket of ancient rock thrust upward from the ocean floor. But the theory did not explain the missing people, nor the photographs showing light suspended in midair. The official files ended there, marked unresolved. Those who studied the evidence later spoke of a silence within the recordings, an unnatural gap between jungle sounds, as though the forest had stopped to listen. One audio engineer, reviewing the final reel, claimed to hear faint speech embedded in the static, a voice counting backward in a language that could not be identified. When the recording was played again, the voice was gone. The reel was sealed in a government archive, and the warehouse where it had been stored collapsed years later during a flood, destroying the last physical trace of the expedition. Eyewitness rumours continued long after, passed quietly among researchers who had heard fragments of the story. Some said they had seen new camps built deep within the interior, bearing modern supplies that had never been recorded as missing. Others whispered of a new clearing near the river, perfectly circular and devoid of insects or sound. Satellite images confirmed no such place existed, yet those who ventured into that region spoke of compasses that spun and echoes that did not return. What remains of the Borneo expedition exists only in fragments, film, notes, and the unspoken understanding that something out there observed them until the very last moment. The spirits of the New Guinea Highlands. Far above the coastal jungles, the land changes into a world of mist and stone where the air thins and voices carry strangely through the valleys. The mountains of Papua New Guinea rise in folds so steep and green that clouds cling to them as if trapped, and rivers fall from unseen cliffs in silver threads. For centuries, these highlands remained a mystery to outsiders, protected by distance and belief. Even when planes first traced their contours in the 1930s, many still thought the interior uninhabited. What explorers found instead were entire communities hidden among the ridges, living in isolation that had lasted since time before memory, surrounded by a forest that seemed to breathe in rhythm with them. Among those drawn to this high country was an anthropological team from Sydney driven by rumours of uncontacted tribes whose rituals defied explanation. Led by Dr. Malcolm Reed, the group included linguists, biologists, and a photographer known for his work on indigenous art forms. Their goal was to record and preserve vanishing traditions, but for Reed it was more than documentation. In his notes he wrote that the highlands felt closer to the beginning of the world than anywhere else on Earth, and that within the fog he sensed something older than thought itself. Their arrival in Tari marked the beginning of a study that would never be completed, though their recordings and notebooks survived long enough to tell fragments of the story. The villagers who met them did not object to their presence, but insisted on guiding their every step. They taught them which paths could be walked only at certain hours, which stones to avoid, and when to stop speaking. Reed's interpreter described their fear as polite, like people addressing a river that can hear. The expedition set up camp on the edge of the forest, where the valley dipped into a basin filled with constant mist. In the early weeks, the team found the highland villages welcoming yet wary, as though each visitor's presence carried an unseen cost. They filmed ceremonies of dance and music where participants painted themselves in ash and ochre and spoke in chants too fast to follow. Yet when the outsiders asked to record more, elders shook their heads. Certain songs, they said, were not meant to be heard twice. One evening, a villager led Reed to a line of stone monoliths half buried in moss. He explained that they were doors for voices, placed by ancestors so the dead could return and listen. Whispers began when the team set up their camp near a site the locals called the Place of Returning Voices, a stone circle said to echo with the dead. The name intrigued Reed, who believed it to be a remnant of ancient sound rituals. But others noticed that the echo did not behave as expected. It would answer even when no one spoke, and sometimes continue long after words had stopped. The photographer noted in his diary that when he stood near the stones, he felt the air thicken, as though something invisible pressed against him. Nights grew restless, filled with muffled sounds like footsteps circling the tents. What began as observations slowly turned into participation. The scientists joined ceremonies they did not understand, believing they were merely witnessing tradition. The villagers encouraged it, painting symbols on their arms and whispering phrases said to protect them from unseen watchers. During one ritual, Reed was told to lie flat on the earth with his eyes closed while the chants rose around him. He later wrote that he felt a vibration in the ground, as if the soil beneath him was breathing in unison with the voices. He did not speak of it again. It was during one of these nights that the boundary between the known and the imagined began to blur, and the forest itself seemed to respond. The sounds of the jungle fell silent all at once, leaving only the pulse of drums and wind. A student named Holloway claimed to have seen faint lights weaving through the trees, bluish and slow, like lanterns carried by unseen hands. When he tried to photograph them, the film overexposed entirely. From that point forward, the team reported recurring dreams of shadowed figures standing over them, faces unrecognizable, breath cold as the rain that fell every afternoon. Days later, strange behavior spread through the camp, silences, sleeplessness, and a sense of being followed even when alone. Members began walking into the forest without reason, returning hours later, unable to explain where they had gone. The interpreter overheard one of them, speaking softly in a language not their own. Dr. Reed's notes became fragmented, his handwriting slanted and uneven, with phrases repeating across pages. "The stones remember. They know our names." Attempts to maintain discipline dissolved when 2 porters fled at night, leaving behind their supplies and journals. When the first recording malfunctioned, they blamed moisture, but every new reel captured something else, a low hum beneath every human voice. The sound technician described it as a second speech too deep for words, though analysis later revealed that the frequency matched no known natural source. Even the insects seemed to fall silent whenever they replayed the tapes, as if reacting to something beyond hearing. Some speculated it was interference from the camp's generators, but others began to speak in whispers, convinced that the spirits of the valley had begun to mimic them. By the time the monsoon came, the highlands had already claimed the expedition's reason, leaving behind only pages scrawled with words no one could translate. The rain cut them off from the outside world for weeks. When a helicopter finally reached the valley, it found the camp half drowned, equipment scattered, and tents flattened. Only 2 members were alive, both fevered, emaciated, and unable to explain what had happened. They refused to sleep indoors after evacuation, claiming the air sounded different under a roof. In later years, other researchers returned to the highlands, hoping to recover the lost recordings. Many were found intact, but when played, they contained nothing except faint breathing and the same deep resonance that had haunted the first expedition. Attempts to restore the sound only deepened it, producing a tone that caused equipment to fail. Local elders warned that the valley's spirits had been disturbed, and that their silence was not forgiveness, but waiting. The valley keeps their names whispered among the stones, carried on the mist, and the highlands have not stopped listening since. The Lost Amazon River Expedition. At the river's edge, the expedition's boats waited, gleaming in the morning sun, promising adventure but delivering a silent warning. The men and women aboard carried charts, journals, and an unshakable belief in their own skill, convinced that the Amazon, for all its untamed power, could be charted, understood, and conquered. Local guides whispered caution, their eyes scanning the thick canopy as though expecting the forest to answer back. Yet ambition drowned out fear, and the expedition pushed off into the currents, leaving the known world behind. Among the crew were men trained in navigation and survival, yet none could foresee how the jungle would test both body and mind. Botanists marvelled at orchids that bloomed in impossible places, while cartographers argued over tributary paths that refused to match their maps. Soldiers carried rifles, though the only enemy seemed to be the environment itself, unyielding heat, constant rain, and the hum of insects that gnawed at both flesh and patience. A photographer noted in his diary that the air felt thick as clay, heavy with the scent of decay and green growth. They pushed forward with charts and instruments, mapping tributaries that appeared one day and vanished the next, the forest swallowing the landscape as easily as water. Trees leaned toward them, branches forming arches that obscured the sky, while rivers forked and merged with disorienting speed. Each mile brought new challenges, rapids that churned unexpectedly, floating vegetation that snagged boats, and sudden storms that forced the crew to anchor in the mud, their progress measured in feet rather than leagues. It was a place where time seemed to fold, where days ran together beneath the ceaseless canopy. By the second week, unease began to settle over the group, small frictions magnifying beneath the relentless heat and endless green. Arguments broke out over navigation, rations, and the speed of travel. Some crew members refused to enter certain tributaries, claiming they felt watched, as though the river itself disapproved. One cartographer, a man known for calm and precision, began muttering to himself about rivers that remembered their course and islands that shifted positions when no one looked. The others laughed at first, then grew quiet when the sounds of movement echoed among the trees at night. Strange sounds echoed at night along the riverbanks, rhythms that seemed neither animal nor human, punctuating the darkness with questions no one dared answer. Drums or footsteps, maybe both, appeared just beyond campfire's light, fading when approached. The guides claimed these were the spirits of the forest, but the explorers dismissed them as superstition, until they began to notice patterns. Each sound coincided with sudden illness or a boat gone missing, as if the jungle signalled its disapproval through its own cryptic language. Some boats went missing in the fog, only to be found days later overturned or empty, as though the river had claimed them deliberately. One morning, a canoe was discovered tangled in vines, with paddles gone and footprints leading nowhere. Another was found wedged between two tree trunks, the occupants absent and personal effects neatly arranged, as if placed by invisible hands. Fear spread faster than the illness that had begun creeping through the crew, whispering that the jungle's patience was finite. Maps lost coherence as rivers shifted and islands appeared where none existed before. Even the most experienced navigators began to doubt their bearings. Latitude and longitude no longer aligned, and compass needles wavered in inexplicable directions. Notes in journals became erratic, sketches of curves and loops, annotations that made less sense with each passing day. Attempts to retrace steps only revealed paths already erased by rain, fallen trees, or shifting water, leaving the explorers trapped in a labyrinth that offered no exit. Even the wildlife seemed to conspire with the river, observers later wrote, noting that birds circled endlessly over campsites without landing, monkeys followed silently yet vanished when approached, and fish leapt unnaturally from the water as if warning intruders. At night, bioluminescent insects flickered in patterns that suggested letters or symbols, and the explorers began interpreting them as messages meant only for those attuned to the jungle. Small anomalies, shifting footprints along muddy banks, trees that seemed freshly cut but showed no mark of a blade, convinced some that the forest itself was alive in a purposeful, watchful way. When illness struck, it moved unpredictably, sparing some while leaving others delirious and incoherent, their voices carrying cryptic warnings that vanished by morning. Fever burned through the group, bringing hallucinations, rage, and silence in equal measure. Men wandered off into the foliage, returning hours later shaken and mute, unable to explain where they had gone or what they had seen. The doctor's journal, later recovered, contained entries scratched frantically across pages. Water moves, eyes follow, do not trust the banks. Survivors later claimed that at certain points the water itself seemed to move against them, currents rising and falling without explanation, guiding them into the forest's tight embrace. Boats collided with submerged roots, drifted backward, or stalled in eddies too precise to be natural. Some swore the river laughed at them, carrying whispers that mimicked their own words. The guides refused to proceed beyond a certain bend, leaving only the bravest or most stubborn to continue, though none ever returned to speak of it. No trace remains of the expedition beyond fragmented journals and the occasional artifact washed ashore, leaving the river to keep its secrets untouched. Pieces of journals emerged years later from the silt, waterlogged pages filled with names, sketches of islands, and frantic notations about voices, lights, and impossible waterways. Maps were found torn and chewed by insects, and instruments rusted beyond recognition. Even in modern surveys, portions of the river's path appear to have vanished, suggesting that the forest and water together conceal what they choose. Somewhere along its winding course, the Amazon keeps the expedition's whispers, carrying them beneath a canopy where no living soul can follow. The Sarowok Cave Mystery. A narrow fissure yawned in the limestone cliff, promising secrets that had drawn adventurers for decades. Locals whispered of hidden chambers and echoes that were older than memory, yet curiosity triumphed over caution. An expedition of geologists and spelunkers arrived with ropes, lights, and instruments designed to chart the uncharted. They spoke of discovering passages untouched by man, corridors carved by water over millennia, and the thrill of stepping where no one had walked. What they did not realize was that the cave demanded a different kind of attention, one that measured patience and sanity in equal measure. Torchlight flickered along walls carved by water over millennia, revealing shapes that seemed to shift as eyes followed. Stalactites hung like teeth, stalagmites rose like jagged defences, and minerals glinted in patterns that teased the mind. Sounds bounced endlessly, footsteps multiplying unnaturally, and water dripped from unseen ceilings with an unpredictable rhythm. Even seasoned explorers felt their hearts tighten, as though the cave itself was assessing them, learning who might falter first. The first explorers slipped into the cavern, unaware that every step would twist perception and memory. Passages that seemed straight opened into spirals, alcoves duplicated endlessly, and faint draughts carried scents that were both earthy and metallic. Conversations were fragmented, and words lost their clarity before they could reach an ear. Guides, normally unshakable, began pausing for moments too long, staring into corners where darkness had no depth. Deep within, the air became thick, each breath heavy with humidity and the metallic tang of unseen minerals. Light reflected oddly, creating illusions that misled even the most careful climbers. Some reported seeing walls breathe or shift imperceptibly, or shadows that lingered longer than possible. Small slips on slick stone, near misses with falling debris, and disorientation contributed to an atmosphere in which rational thought began to fray. Faint traces of movement appeared along walls that should have remained untouched. Muddy handprints, scratches in soft stone, and displaced rocks suggested someone or something had passed moments before, though no one claimed to have moved there. Some explorers felt compelled to follow the marks, only to find themselves at dead ends or facing sheer drops that had not existed when approached earlier. Whispers echoed from corners that led nowhere, creating a sensation that unseen guides or watchers were orchestrating their path deeper into the cavern. Some passages seemed alive, as if the stone itself shifted slightly when approached, leaving gaps where none had existed before. Explorers found themselves backtracking along routes they were certain they had just taken. Equipment disappeared inexplicably, ropes tangled without explanation, and the faint sound of dripping water turned into a chorus of whispers that could not be traced to any source. Anxiety mounted with every step, as if the cave was aware of their fear and feeding upon it. Voices echoed unnaturally, returning fragments of conversation that had never been spoken aloud. Laughter, questions, and cries were warped by the stone, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. Some members claimed to hear guides calling their names, only to find them asleep or absent. Sleep was fitful. The mind played tricks, conjuring tunnels and rooms where none existed, merging memory with the present. Shadows pooled in corners and stretched unnaturally toward them. Explorers reported seeing forms that resembled people or animals, yet they moved contrary to gravity or faded when approached. The reflective surfaces of mineral deposits created illusions that sometimes mimicked the explorer's own gestures, causing confusion and panic. One geologist later described feeling hands brush against his back, though the nearest colleague was several meters away. These encounters compounded exhaustion and blurred the line between reality and hallucination. Instruments failed, compasses spun without reason, lights flickered, and ropes frayed inexplicably under weight. Attempts to chart the caverns became hopeless as corridors multiplied, some leading to sheer drops or impassable barriers that had not been visible in previous passes. Notes taken by the explorers grew incoherent, diagrams collapsing into scribbles and symbols that resisted interpretation. Every attempt at control only deepened the sense that the cave rejected intrusion. Maps drawn during early exploration vanished from journals or became unreadable, as if the cave refused to be catalogued. Even photographs failed to capture the scale and depth of the chambers. Shadows appeared to move between exposures, and reflections on mineral surfaces created false doorways. Descriptions of landmarks became contradictory, with one group swearing a chamber contained a waterfall, while another insisted the same space had been dry and empty. A lone journal discovered years later recorded footsteps that led nowhere, whispers in the dark, and the persistent sense of being watched. The entries hinted at paranoia, exhaustion, and the gradual disappearance of those who had once entered in pairs or small groups. One passage noted that a guide had vanished mid-step, leaving behind only a boot filled with mud and a trembling flashlight. The cave's silence followed him, as if the walls had swallowed him whole. Evidence suggested that some chambers were never meant to be entered. Bone fragments, shattered helmets, and tools left in perfect alignment hinted at sudden events that prevented retreat. Mineral formations appeared deliberately shaped, resembling barriers or doorways, yet with no functional purpose. Those few who survived and later recounted the expedition spoke of passages that seemed to rearrange themselves, forcing them into loops or toward areas already searched. Each step became a gamble, where logic no longer guaranteed safety. No one has returned from the deepest chambers, leaving only questions and shadows that stretch beyond memory. Artifacts and equipment recovered long after the expeditions disappeared suggested hurried retreats or sudden calamity, yet no explanation satisfied both reason and local superstition. Researchers today still study the caves cautiously, often stopping short of the passages first explored, respecting a boundary that may be more than mere rock and shadow. Protected by the thick jungle of Sarowok, the caves hold the vanished footsteps in shadowed memory. The Mapmakers of the Lost River. A river untouched by modern surveyors wound through dense greenery, promising discoveries that few dared chase. Cartographers, armed with the latest instruments and unshakable determination, set out to trace its path, certain that their maps would tame the unknown. Local guides whispered warnings of shifting banks, unseen currents, and the jungle's capacity to erase even the most meticulous footprints. Yet ambition pushed them forward, led by the belief that precise observation could conquer the vast, untamed river. The first sketches captured bends, tributaries, and unusual eddies, yet the jungle refused consistency, altering landmarks with every rain. Trees fell where none had stood the day before, sandbars vanished overnight, and islands seemed to rise from the depths in patterns that defied understanding. Notes became increasingly fragmented, diagrams dotted with question marks, and distances measured in uncertain approximations. Sudden storms transformed calm stretches into torrents, submerging camps and sweeping away tools. Flood waters consumed carefully marked trails, leaving the mapmakers stranded on shifting banks. Leeches clung to ankles, snakes slipped silently through undergrowth, and hidden rapids roared where the river had been still hours earlier. The expedition's early confidence began to waver, each setback reinforcing the sense that the jungle and river were conspiring together. Compasses spun in defiance of reason, needles pointing simultaneously toward and away from the same direction. Surveyors could no longer trust their instruments, Even the most experienced navigators felt the creeping grip of uncertainty. At times, maps drawn hours earlier contradicted visible features, and attempts to reconcile observations only intensified confusion. Arguments erupted quietly at first, a low hum of tension that grew as exhaustion warped judgment. Team members began to question one another, suspecting intentional misdirection or carelessness. Shadows in the trees were misidentified as guides, and hallucinations of figures moving along riverbanks sowed paranoia. Trust frayed as quickly as their instruments failed, leaving the mapmakers isolated even within their own group. Journals became maps of both geography and anxiety, filled with notations, diagrams, and increasingly frantic warnings. Sketches documented islands that disappeared overnight, streams that shifted course, and towering trees that seemed to relocate with the seasons. Each entry grew more erratic, penmanship shaking, margins crowded with scribbles, and symbols whose meaning was unclear even to those who wrote them. The line between observation and imagination blurred as exhaustion and isolation took their toll. A sense of the river as a living, calculating force crept into the margins. Words like watched and followed appeared in the notes, written in ink smudged by constant humidity. Each bend revealed another contradiction, a river that should flow in one direction but looped back, islands that appeared and disappeared, and sudden rapids that did not exist in prior observations. The mapmakers began to question their own senses. The jungle seemed to rearrange itself to confound them. A guide would point toward a bend that had vanished overnight, or an eddy that had formed in a place previously charted as calm water. Day after day, the river's illusions compounded, and the explorers' confidence eroded. Even the air seemed to pulse differently depending on direction, as if the jungle itself sought to mislead them. Mist hung over the river in the mornings, thick and unyielding, obscuring landmarks and swallowing the sound of movement. The dense fog disoriented the mapmakers further, hiding dangers such as hidden eddies, submerged logs, and unexpected drop-offs. They often lost sight of companions for hours, only to reunite in locations that seemed impossibly far from where they had been. The jungle amplified every small sound, the slap of a branch, the splash of water, as though mocking their attempts at precision. Tools and journals left unattended would vanish or appear elsewhere, feeding a creeping belief that the river itself had agency, resisting documentation and punishing those who tried to control it. Voices drifted from the forest margin, sometimes human, sometimes unplaceable, always reminding the surveyors that they were not alone. Some claimed to hear children laughing, distant calls, or warnings shouted in unknown tongues. Others swore that faint drums echoed from deep within the jungle, yet whenever they approached the sound, it would dissolve into silence. One evening a guide vanished for hours, returning pale and muttering words no one understood. Belongings left unattended were sometimes discovered in impossible locations, ropes tangled atop branches, journals tucked into the roots of giant trees, or compasses embedded in mud far from the campsite. Anxiety spread quietly among the team, conversations shortened, eyes darted at shadows, and every rustle of leaves became a potential threat. Rations dwindled and equipment decayed, wet paper curled, ink blurred, and instruments rusted before completing their work. Measurements lost accuracy, photographs faded, and compasses refused guidance. Attempts to signal for help failed. Radios carried only static, and smoke from emergency fires disappeared without drawing notice from nearby settlements. Even the most prepared expedition members began to feel the river's pull, as if the jungle itself demanded their presence and attention. Some fell ill from contaminated water, others collapsed from exhaustion, and still more wandered off for hours, returning dazed or not at all. The daily battle to remain oriented became both physically and mentally overwhelming. Sketches of landmarks became unintelligible, strange symbols replacing once clear annotations, reflecting the mapmakers' growing disorientation. Rivers that flowed into themselves, trees marked with unrecognizable carvings, and small sketches of creatures never seen in daylight-filled margins. Each new observation contradicted the last, and the maps became documents of a place that defied human logic. Nights were sleepless, filled with strange sounds that seemed to follow their every movement, while the dense green horizon erased all sense of progress. Survivors later reported dreams so vivid they could not distinguish them from actual events, a layering of perception that further fragmented memory, A single compass recovered years later spun endlessly, preserved among fragments of journals and charts left where the river met the jungle. Archaeologists and surveyors who examined the remnants were baffled. Distances noted in the journals did not match the terrain, and some symbols remain undeciphered. Notes hinted at sudden storms, unseen currents, and companions who vanished mid-stride, leaving behind only smeared journals and discarded instruments. The documents suggested a deliberate, if unseen, hand moving against them, a force that could erase efforts and memories alike. The lost river continues to flow in silence, carrying traces of those who tried to master it and never returned. The jungle ruins that should have remained hidden. Hidden beneath centuries of foliage, the ruins emerged like a puzzle no one alive could solve. Moss and thick vines clung to crumbling walls, masking staircases and passageways that had once guided countless feet. The canopy above filtered sunlight into shifting patterns, lending an eerie life to stone that had not seen human attention for generations. Early photographs captured arches and columns, but even the camera struggled to contain the depth and scale of what lay before the explorers. Each discovery hinted at an intelligence long vanished, yet impressively sophisticated, and yet a quiet unease threaded through the team's excitement. The first inscriptions etched into crumbling stone were elegant yet unintelligible, drawing both admiration and unease. Symbols repeated with rhythm and variation, suggesting a language or code that none of the linguists could decipher. At times, lines seemed to shift when revisited, appearing subtly altered from memory, though weathered stone should not change. The team debated whether their eyes were playing tricks or whether the site itself resisted comprehension. The historian among them cautioned that some ruins carry warnings meant for those unprepared, but the thrill of discovery overpowered prudence. Excavation revealed chambers long swallowed by roots, each passage a labyrinth of unknown purpose. Floors were sunken, sometimes collapsing under careful steps, and ceilings were draped with lianas that brushed the explorers' shoulders as they ducked. Small alcoves contained stone vessels and carved figures whose function was impossible to determine. Some rooms seemed to echo the smallest sound, while others absorbed it entirely, creating a disorienting rhythm that left the explorers tense. Even maps made in the field became difficult to reconcile with actual layouts, corridors that seemed linear in sketches twisted unpredictably in reality. The team's notes quickly filled with sketches, measurements, and anxious observations as every artifact seemed to shift subtly when left unattended. Tools and journals misplaced themselves inexplicably, sometimes found hours later tucked into corners or beneath loose stones. One explorer swore he left a carved idol on a pedestal only to discover it vanished, replaced by a smaller, unidentifiable object. These small anomalies multiplied, feeding suspicions that the ruins were active in some way, guiding or punishing those who sought to understand them. Arguments over whether these events were natural, coincidental, or supernatural began to punctuate workdays, and even the most rational minds felt an oppressive weight pressing against reason. Shadows stretched differently than natural light should allow, bending around corners where no obstruction existed. The team began to notice shapes at the edges of perception, glimpsed peripherally, but gone when directly observed. A guide insisted he saw figures among the rubble, tall, motionless, watching, but the rest of the team found nothing. Even in full daylight, the ruins seemed alive, walls twisting subtly, angles shifting, hallways elongating or shortening, disorienting anyone trying to establish a fixed reference. Maps and sketches were quickly rendered unreliable, creating tension as explorers began relying more on memory than instruments. Through the labyrinthine tunnels, faint voices drifted, barely forming words yet enough to unsettle the explorers. Footsteps or murmurs seemed to come from above and below simultaneously, sometimes repeating phrases that no one could decipher. Attempts to communicate with locals outside the ruins proved fruitless. They claimed the forest itself was home to spirits who did not welcome the living. Nights were sleepless, filled with imagined or real sounds that tangled with exhaustion-induced hallucinations. The combination of oppressive humidity, insect swarms, and unexplainable phenomena blurred the line between perception and reality. Tools went missing, only to reappear in impossible places, or sometimes not at all, leaving the team questioning both the ruins and themselves. Tents pitched near the perimeter were found undone, ropes severed, and supplies scattered in ways that suggested interference yet revealed no culprit. Even the most careful inventory could not prevent confusion from mounting. One archaeologist found his measuring instruments embedded in the walls as if intentionally placed, while another's journal appeared covered in mud despite being kept on a raised platform. These incidents fanned the embers of paranoia, leaving the expedition unsure whom or what to trust. Journals grew frantic, margins crowded with warnings and lines crossed out as the expedition's cohesion fractured. Daily logs became erratic, some pages only partially legible, with shorthand notes that made little sense. Sketches depicted not only artifacts and chambers but also faces, figures, and strange shapes emerging from walls. Each entry reflected the explorers' growing obsession, their fear, and their inability to understand the ruins' full scope. Even leaders who tried to maintain authority were not immune. They recorded entries in palimpsest style, overwriting earlier notes in a desperate attempt to assert control over chaos. Rain seeped through cracks, soaking notes and softening walls, yet the ruins refused to collapse, standing as if waiting. Pools of water collected in depressions, reflecting the canopy and the team's anxious faces, while droplets struck stone in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. Mud and decay softened once solid floors, but no matter how fragile the site appeared, it resisted destruction. Branches fell in the surrounding forest, leaves rustled ominously, yet the core of the ruins remained intact, seeming impervious to both natural erosion and human interference. The jungle swallowed the site again after the last footprints faded, leaving only questions, half-buried artifacts, and whispers of what had transpired. Researchers returning months later found evidence of disturbance but no clear trace of the expedition, only tools partially buried and journals weathered beyond legibility. The ruins had reclaimed themselves as completely as they had been unearthed, with nature and time working together to erase signs of intrusion. Legends of the place grew quietly among local communities, tales of explorers who entered and never returned, their curiosity punished by a site that had long refused to yield its secrets. No record remains of the last footsteps within those walls, only the silent ruin that waits patiently for the next intrusion, unbroken and unforgiving. The Pharmaceutical expedition's fatal discovery. Dew clung to the leaves as the team stepped cautiously along the narrow path, each footfall sinking slightly into the spongy forest floor. The trees rose in irregular towers, their branches twisting as though to conceal something beyond sight. Even before the first specimens were collected, a quiet tension hung in the air, pressing on the chest and sharpening every sound. The expedition, composed of scientists and botanists from several nations, moved slowly, notebooks and containers in hand, aware that the jungle held secrets it was unwilling to reveal. A faint shimmer ran across the water's surface, something that did not reflect light naturally. One of the younger botanists leaned close, noting ripples that folded back on themselves. Others followed, observing the anomaly in silence. Their journals were filled with meticulous sketches of leaves, bark and flowers, yet a sense of incompleteness crept into their entries. Every day more samples were collected. Each carefully preserved, yet subtle irregularities began to surface. Beneath the canopy, the air felt heavier than usual, carrying scents no one could name. Breaths came in short, hot bursts, sticky with humidity. Insects swarmed persistently, circling the group before disappearing into the undergrowth. The scientists laughed nervously at first, attributing unease to fatigue, but the sensation persisted, as if the forest itself catalogued them alongside the plants they collected. Notes were scribbled hastily in a journal, capturing irregularities in the plants. A vine that should have been limp curled toward a tent. A blossom that had closed at night opened at unusual hours. Measurements conflicted with previous records, and the team began to question their own observations. Some wrote that the jungle pulsed rhythmically, affecting not just flora, but their own senses, as though each heartbeat of the forest echoed inside them. Specimens twitched in containers, though no wind stirred the tents. Initially dismissed as a mechanical error, patterns emerged, a leaf moving subtly when no one approached, a petal curling as if recoiling. Anxiety crept, spreading like the first signs of a fever. Conversations slowed, pauses lengthened, and the laughter of the previous days faded into a nervous hush. The river's current whispered oddly, carrying sounds the team could not identify. One night, the group ventured closer to the water, but the ripples moved against themselves in impossible patterns. Discussions erupted. Some defended scientific reasoning, others insisted the jungle defied comprehension. A few swore they saw shapes beneath the surface, dark forms that vanished when approached. Insects congregated around one sample, then dispersed without explanation, leaving scientists uneasy. Feverish excitement shifted to dread as subtle symptoms emerged: mild nausea, headaches, and restlessness that preceded collapse. A junior researcher noted that the patterns in plant decay seemed synchronized with these symptoms. Some began to avoid the samples they had handled earlier, convinced that touching the plants triggered the illness. Footprints appeared, leading nowhere, merging with the mud as if erased by an unseen hand. The group debated whether these were small animals or hallucinations, but the prints persisted over days, each more distinct, then vanishing. A senior botanist collapsed clutching a sample. Soon others followed irregularly, each fall heightening fear and suspicion that the jungle claimed them deliberately. A sudden silence fell over the camp, broken only by faint scratching in the undergrowth. Remaining scientists tried to continue, documenting what they could, but notes grew fragmented, diagrams overlapping with smeared sentences. They recorded small oddities, whispers echoing words they themselves had written, vials rattling without reason, and patterns in plant decay that repeated night after night. By the third week, the expedition was a ghost of its intended purpose. Tents were left half-packed, containers rotting in the damp, journals open to pages with scrawled warnings. Do not trust the green. It watches, it waits. Even those still conscious avoided certain areas, drawn to others by unexplainable impulses. A makeshift observation post revealed more anomalies. Leaves bent inward toward unknown centres, water pooling in impossible depressions, and insects moving in coordinated geometric patterns that defied biology. Maps and notes were left behind in disarray. Measurements contradicted previous observations, as if the jungle had rewritten itself overnight. One researcher recorded the chilling sensation of being followed, yet no footprints appeared for the observer. Night brought a chorus of distant calls, not of known animals, but something resembling speech, just beyond comprehension. Many reported hearing their own names whispered, carried in the wind though no one spoke. Small discoveries began to take on a sinister quality. Seeds germinated instantly after being collected, sending shoots twisting unnaturally, as though animated. Containers would be found overturned the next morning and specimens missing, sometimes replaced with leaves that were familiar yet impossible. The patterns became predictably, horrifyingly consistent. The closer a scientist observed, the faster the anomaly spread. Illness spread inexorably, first mild, then sharp, bringing delirium that caused researchers to wander off into the jungle for hours, returning disoriented and drenched, mumbling about whispers and moving shadows. One kept a record of the days he survived, counting time in relation to plant growth and decay, but eventually even he stopped writing, leaving only blank pages and smudges. By the final days, the camp had dissolved into fragments of tents, broken equipment, and scattered journals. Only the faint smell of plants, fresh yet uncanny, permeated the air, lingering over the mud and decaying wood. Attempts to leave were thwarted by the unrelenting jungle. Trails disappeared overnight, rivers shifted, and sunlight was filtered into dull greens, disorienting anyone who tried to navigate. The final report ended abruptly. Fragments of data and observations scattered, some in code, some in sketches resembling symbols no one understood. The expedition's equipment was later recovered, abandoned, and half buried beneath forest litter. Modern analysis detected traces of unknown compounds, but the cause of the deaths remained unresolved. The jungle had claimed its toll silently, leaving only fragments, questions, and a silence that seemed almost sentient. The expedition vanished, leaving only questions the jungle refused to answer. The rescue mission that never returned. Morning broke over the endless canopy, spilling muted light across the leaves and the narrow path where the rescuers stepped cautiously. They carried provisions, maps and radios that had been tested repeatedly before departure, confident that skill and planning could overcome whatever had claimed the original expedition. The air was thick and humid, saturated with the scent of decay and damp earth, and every footfall was met with the hiss of insects that seemed to watch from above. Spirits were high at first, bolstered by determination, yet a subtle unease threaded through their ranks as they passed the first abandoned camp of the missing explorers. Tracks led into shadows no one dared enter. Footprints vanished where roots knotted the soil, and discarded equipment hinted at struggle or sudden retreat. A broken compass lay nearby, needle spinning erratically as if defying the laws it had always obeyed. The rescuers noted every anomaly, yet pressed on, driven by the belief that human perseverance could pierce the jungle's veil. Conversations became sparse, replaced by strained glances, the hum of the forest filling silences with an oppressive watchfulness. Rain fell relentlessly, washing away certainty and smearing trail markers into obscurity. Paths carved by machetes hours earlier had shifted, replaced by tangle and mud that mocked memory. Rivers, once mapped and measured, surged without warning, carrying branches and debris that obliterated familiar landmarks. Even the strongest among them felt their footing unsteady, a creeping dread settling into muscles and minds as if the forest itself was testing endurance before allowing further passage. Voices carried faintly through the mist, distant calls that might have been animals or echoes of the lost expedition. Yet their cadence was wrong, too structured, too deliberate. Some team members whispered that they recognized words, syllables that suggested intelligence, though no human presence could be seen. Nights became a cacophony of sounds, the cries and rustles amplifying fear, leaving the rescuers unsure whether the forest was alive with predators or with memories of those who'd vanished before them. Equipment lay scattered, untouched by human hands. Packs were torn open, rations missing, maps soaked into illegibility, as though the jungle had reached forward to erase any trace of planning. Even careful radio transmissions returned distorted signals, fragmented and indecipherable. Shadows appeared in corners where light could not penetrate, and the men's eyes strained to find form in the chaos, their imaginations quickened by exhaustion and heat. A map, smeared and torn, hinted at paths that no longer existed. Rivers that once ran south had shifted overnight, trails curved into dead ends, and landmarks vanished as though the jungle had reshaped itself in the darkness. Attempts to retrace steps led only deeper into confusion, as if the expedition were walking in circles, endlessly trapped within the labyrinth of leaves and roots. Anxiety mounted, and murmurs of retreat were silenced by the conviction that turning back would be just as dangerous as pressing forward. Footsteps echoed where none should have been. At dawn, someone reported hearing a second set of boots alongside their own, matching pace but belonging to no visible figure. Shadows seemed to move in tandem with the group, and fleeting glimpses of shapes at the edge of vision suggested others were there, spectres of the missing or something entirely different. Even those hardened by previous jungle treks felt their nerves fraying, the line between reality and imagination blurring with each passing hour. Suspicion grew among the men as the jungle seemed to stretch infinitely. Arguments erupted over the direction of travel, over interpretations of signs that could have been misread or deliberately misleading. Paranoia took root, trust waned. Decisions that would have been routine became desperate acts, and small errors compounded into dangerous missteps, leading some to wander off for only minutes but return hours later, dazed and silent. Rations dwindled faster than expected, leaving anxiety in their place. Food and water became obsessions, yet even those who rationed carefully found themselves weak and feverish. The heat pressed upon them relentlessly, saplings and vines scratching skin, leaves cutting into arms and necks, while the insects feasted. Exhaustion mingled with hunger to cloud thought, and each step forward became a trial of will, the jungle pushing back against every effort to impose order or control. Night brought a chorus of calls not found in any field guide. Unidentifiable cries echoed across ravines, accompanied by rustles that suggested movement just beyond torchlight. Fear became tangible, pressing against the chest and making sleep impossible. Some swore they saw figures moving between the trees, only to vanish when approached. The air seemed thick with watching eyes, real or imagined, and the boundary between the living and the lost expedition blurred into uncertainty. A journal was found, pages scratched with hurried, incoherent notes. It belonged to one of the missing team members from the original expedition, its entries describing fever, confusion, and fear of the forest itself. Mentions of voices behind the leaves and rivers that shift while I sleep were repeated in half-legible script. The rescuers read with unease, understanding too late that they were tracing the same doomed route, following echoes of a terror that had already claimed lives. Lightning revealed glimpses of something moving between the trees, shapes solidified for a heartbeat, only to dissolve again in rain and shadow. Instruments malfunctioned, compasses spinning, radios screaming static. The rescuers began to doubt the very fabric of the forest, convinced it was alive in a way that human understanding could not penetrate. Each flash of lightning deepened the sense that the jungle was testing, warning, and consuming simultaneously. The river shifted unnaturally, erasing any trace of their path. Bridges found intact the previous day were gone, and stepping stones had been swept away. Attempts to mark progress were futile. Stakes and ribbons disappeared, leaves closed over footprints, and the jungle's endless density erased memory of where they had been. Panic began to gnaw at resolve, leaving only instinct and the hope that pressing forward might lead to salvation. Compasses spun without guidance, mocking experience and training alike. Those who had once led were no longer confident. Even seasoned explorers hesitated at junctions, trusting neither maps nor intuition. The men could no longer tell north from south, and each decision felt like a gamble against something that was not entirely natural. The sense of being trapped, observed, and manipulated weighed upon them with every step, and cohesion fractured under the relentless pressure. One by one, the rescuers vanished into foliage that seemed to swallow sound. Calls went unanswered, footsteps disappeared, and frantic searching yielded nothing. The remaining few pressed onward with dread clawing at their minds, knowing instinctively that the forest would not release them willingly. Their radios offered no comfort, their maps no guidance, and the day lengthened without end. No trace of the rescuers was ever found, and the fate of those who had set out to save the lost remains a question the jungle refuses to answer. The fever that spared no one. The air of the jungle hung thick and suffocating, a wet blanket of heat and humidity that seemed to press down on every limb and every thought. From the moment the expedition had set foot in the dense canopy of the upper Amazon basin, a sense of unease had taken hold. The men carried with them medicines, quinine, and insect repellents, believing themselves equipped to face the challenges of the rainforest. The first signs of illness were subtle. A fever here, a headache there, easy enough to dismiss as heat exhaustion. Limbs ached as if broken from within, muscles burned, and the relentless fevers left men drenched in sweat that could not cool them. The medical officer, a stoic man with years of experience in tropical campaigns, observed the progression with growing concern. Despite the treatments administered, the fever did not relent. Diarrhea and vomiting stripped the men of strength, leaving some so weak they could barely hold themselves upright. The nights were the worst, when delirium crept in alongside the fever. The men would speak incoherently, sometimes sobbing, laughing, and often staring at shadows that were not there. The doctor prescribed rest and fluids, but the jungle's heat and the constant effort to move through dense undergrowth made recovery impossible. Each day brought another collapse. By the end of the first week, the expedition had lost 2 men. They were found in the early morning, their bodies cold and rigid, despite the oppressive humidity. Their deaths sent a ripple of fear through the group. Some blamed contaminated water or a poisonous bite, but the medical officer was quick to note the similarity in symptoms: high fever, disorientation, hallucinations, and sudden collapse. The fever seemed to follow them, lurking in every drop of river water, in every mosquito bite, in the stagnant pools they passed by without thinking. As the illness spread, the jungle around them appeared to shift. The birds fell silent, the usual chorus of insects muted to an almost unnatural stillness. Those who were not yet sick spoke in hushed tones about shadows moving just beyond the line of sight, about the sound of footsteps following them through the undergrowth. A campfire flickered against the darkness, and for a moment it seemed that the flames themselves twisted into shapes human and animal alike, before snapping back to normal. The expedition journal, still partially intact after the chaos, describes a scene of escalating desperation. The men were consumed not only by fever, but by fear. Arguments broke out over water rationing, over the direction they should take, over whether to press forward or turn back. One man, previously composed and reliable, became convinced that the others were conspiring against him. He attacked his companions with a machete before being restrained, his mind completely overtaken. In the small hours of the night, the screams of the delirious echoed through the canopy, mixing with the distant cries of wildlife. As the days passed, the jungle swallowed more of the group. Others simply disappeared, leaving behind only discarded belongings. A hat, a pack, a soaked journal page fluttering in the wind. The survivors moved in a fragile line, supporting one another physically, but there was no escaping the invisible hand that seemed to follow them through the trees. The fever spared no one, but it was not just the disease that claimed them. Madness, a creeping, intangible madness, struck as surely as the mosquitoes or the heat, and in many cases it killed faster than the fever itself. The expedition's leader, a man who had spent decades in remote regions, recorded his observations with increasing detachment, noting that the fever affected each man differently and sparked hallucinations tied to their deepest fears. Some were haunted by imagined predators, memories of home or visions of companions they had already lost. One survivor collapsed beside a swollen river, muttering of shadows rising from the water, while a quiet mapmaker became convinced the compass itself was alive, spinning to point toward death rather than direction. The leader's own strength waned under the relentless heat and infection, and he began to question whether the fever was merely physical or a harbinger of something far more sinister. Attempts to evacuate the sick proved futile. Swollen rivers and impassable trails thwarted every effort to signal for help. While food became scarce and survivors were reduced to drinking from small pools and foraging for often contaminated roots and fruits, which only worsened their condition. Even those familiar with dying in the jungle were unprepared for the simultaneous collapse of mind and body, as men who had once prided themselves on courage became shadows of themselves, whispering to empty spaces or shouting warnings at invisible threats. By the final days, the remaining members moved with a haunting coordination, each aware of the fragility of their companions. They avoided splitting up, fearing what might happen if one fell behind. A journal entry, barely legible, hints at a creeping resignation. The leader writes of an understanding, a dreadful acknowledgement that the jungle did not simply harbour disease, but possessed a will, a way of testing the limits of those who dared enter it. The fever had not merely claimed bodies, it had reshaped the minds of the men, breaking them from the inside out until nothing remained but a hollow awareness of the green world pressing in. When the last survivor finally stumbled from the trees weeks later, he bore the marks of unimaginable suffering, his skin blistered and emaciated, his eyes wild yet haunted by a clarity more terrifying than the fever itself. He could speak only in fragments, recounting the deaths, the madness that overtook his companions, and the whispers that seemed to rise from the trees themselves. Medical examination confirmed he had survived a virulent strain of malaria, but his mind had been permanently altered. Dreams were no longer restful. Shadows haunted his vision even in daylight, and his speech often veered into incoherence. Those who had entered the jungle seeking adventure returned bearing more than illness. They returned with knowledge no words could fully convey. Even today, the clearing where the expedition had camped stands silent, the remnants of burned-out tents and scattered supplies slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. Local guides speak of ghostly figures moving among the trees, of sounds that resemble human voices but vanish when approached. The fever may have ended, but the madness it carried lingers like a faint vibration beneath the canopy, waiting for the next intrusion. Lurking deep in the canopy, the fever waits for the next footsteps to stir it awake. The forgotten surveyors of the Amazon. Vanished without a trace, the government survey team entered the Amazon with the promise of mapping an uncharted expanse, and emerged only as a mystery recorded in fragments. Official records indicate that 5 men set out from Manaus in early 1923, equipped with instruments, notebooks and supplies for a journey meant to last months. Beyond the last known waypoint, however, the trail dissolves into silence. No messages were received, no letters returned, and the dense foliage seems to have swallowed both men and ambition alike. The disappearance itself became the first clue, a riddle that refused solution. Pieces of journals, recovered long after the expedition, form an incomplete record of the surveyor's journey, though the entries remain cryptic, sometimes nonsensical, and frequently interrupted. Sketches of river bends, elevations, and vegetation patterns sit beside hastily scrawled notes. Mentions of unusual animal tracks, sudden weather changes, and the sound of distant drums that could not be identified. One page, stained and torn, describes a small clearing where shadows appeared to move in ways that defied explanation. These remnants suggest that the men were recording more than geography. They were bearing witness to a world that resisted comprehension. Locals from villages near the survey route offer accounts that diverge sharply from the official reports. Elders recall seeing pale figures through the mist, moving methodically along trails that led nowhere. Others tell of fires lit in clearings that burned for days yet left no traces of human presence. Some whisper of strange chanting echoing across rivers at night, while a few claim that the surveyors vanished after entering territories considered sacred, areas rarely traversed by outsiders. These stories, passed down through generations, carry both fear and reverence, blending fact with folklore in ways that confound investigation. Maps found among the archives reveal inconsistencies that suggest the surveyors strayed far from their intended course. Rivers appear misdrawn, tributaries intersect in improbable ways, and contour lines conflict with known elevations. The compass, preserved in a local museum, shows signs of repeated correction and possible tampering, though no definitive explanation exists. Scholars who have examined these materials speculate on magnetic anomalies or environmental interference, yet no consensus emerges. The maps themselves seem to reflect the jungle's insistence on remaining unknowable, resisting the logic imposed by instruments and measurement. Silence pervades the areas the men once traversed, a silence that speaks louder than any recovered document. Explorers who attempted to follow their route decades later report finding campsites stripped bare, footprints washed away by rain, and signs of hurried movement as if the men had fled in panic. The jungle, dense and relentless, conceals every evidence of human passage. Researchers note that the same patches of forest, when surveyed later, appear subtly altered. Vegetation grows in unusual patterns, paths close in on themselves, and animals behave with inexplicable wariness. The absence of the surveyors is mirrored in the absence of natural predictability. Surviving equipment tells a story, one that cannot be dismissed as illness or fatigue alone. Instruments calibrated in the city would suddenly fail, altimeters swung wildly, and compasses refused direction. Notes written in carefully measured script degenerated into erratic scrawls over hours, as though the men themselves had been caught in a shifting reality. One journal entry mentions a figure glimpsed in the river's reflection, watching silently but vanishing when approached. Another recounts a faint echo of voices calling names the men did not recognize. These anomalies hint at the possibility that the jungle intervened, not just passively obstructing travel but actively reshaping perception. In a clearing far from the main trails, artifacts testify to the surveyor's journey, though no clue reveals their ultimate fate. A rusted compass, the only object clearly tied to the expedition, was found buried beneath a tangle of roots. Pages from a notebook appeared partially disintegrated, the writing preserved in fragments that elude coherent interpretation. A partially assembled tripod and lens suggest that they attempted to record visual evidence, yet the images themselves are missing. Each item carries the weight of absence, suggesting activity without outcome, effort without resolution, and a story abruptly severed by the jungle itself. Records from the government offices in Manaus are equally confounding. Correspondence indicates repeated attempts to locate the surveyors, dispatching rescue teams, and making inquiries among local communities. Each report ends with increasing frustration. Trails vanish, campsites offer no clues, and weeks of searching yield nothing. Historians reviewing these documents note an unusual pattern of delay and disappearance that hints at more than mere logistical error. Even bureaucratic observation cannot penetrate the forest's depths, where time and space appear to bend around the men's path, leaving their journey only partially documented and largely unknown. Questions remain unanswered decades later. Why did the surveyors enter a region so dense and uncharted without more robust measures of communication? Were their instruments compromised by environmental factors, or was something in the jungle itself influencing their movement and perception? Why do the fragments of their journals suggest encounters with phenomena that seem impossible to reconcile with ordinary geography? Scholars and explorers alike speculate, but the answers remain elusive, and the forest holds onto its secrets with the patience of centuries. The surveyor's disappearance is not a closed case, but an open-ended puzzle, the pieces scattered across mud, paper, and memory. Legacy persists in the stories, artifacts, and anomalies left behind. Modern expeditions reference the surveyors when marking dangerous or unexplored terrain, cautioning that some regions resist mapping and measurement. Locals maintain oral histories of the expedition, blending the real and the imagined in ways that keep the men's passage alive, even as their fate remains a mystery. The rusted compass, the torn journal pages, and the misaligned maps serve as silent witnesses to a journey that began with the intent to chart the unknown but ended in disappearance. The forest absorbs these traces, but it cannot entirely erase them, leaving a subtle imprint of human curiosity and its peril. Watched by the green shadows above, the surveyor's footsteps linger, waiting to be found or to be forgotten again. The jungle tour that became a nightmare. Canopy shadows stretched over the river, thick and layered as if the forest itself exhaled with the breath of centuries. The tourists arrived in small groups, laughter spilling across the wooden dock, unaware of the silence that had reigned here long before their footsteps. Each footfall pressed against a soft carpet of leaves, a disturbance noted in the subtle twitch of branches and the skittering of insects. The jungle was patient, observing, cataloguing every intrusion into its realm, and it held its secrets close, allowing only glimpses of the unknown to pass between the trunks. Riverbanks cradled the expedition boats as they glided downstream, the water carrying both reflection and shadow. The guides spoke in low tones, pointing out birds and monkeys, but the forest responded in its own rhythms. Currents shifted inexplicably. Reeds bent without wind, small splashes echoed from unseen sources. Tourists marvelled at the beauty, but some glanced repeatedly over their shoulders, sensing movement where none should exist. For each step the humans took, the jungle mirrored, masked, and sometimes misled, making it impossible to separate observation from illusion. Tracks left by boots and sandals were traced over roots and mud, yet they rarely remained intact for long. A sudden rain would erase the path, a fallen branch would redirect it, and within hours the trail could vanish entirely. One tourist journal entry, recovered later, notes frustration at losing the marked route and the sensation that the forest was guiding them somewhere else entirely. Guides attempted to recalibrate compasses, but instruments wavered inexplicably. Even the most seasoned observers reported feeling watched, and sometimes the forest answered, subtly, through rustling leaves, a crack of a branch, a movement glimpsed at the edge of vision. Sounds travelled differently in this part of the jungle. Voices carried, then fell silent. Laughter bounced off unseen walls of vegetation. Calls of wildlife seemed too precise, as if orchestrated. In one early afternoon, a tourist swore she heard another group calling her name from behind a dense copse, only to find the area empty moments later. The guides dismissed it as imagination, yet similar accounts multiplied. Echoes overlapped, footsteps were heard where none had passed, and the air itself seemed to conspire with shadows, warping perception without malice but with an inescapable inevitability. Leaves and vines reacted subtly to human intrusion. A branch snapped in the wrong direction, flowers turned slightly toward a clearing, a tree trunk split as if opening a door that led nowhere. Tourists paused, curious, but misinterpreted the cues as wildlife activity or environmental coincidence. Nightfall brought more anomalies. The moonlight filtered unevenly, creating illusions of movement. Small glimmering eyes were glimpsed in the undergrowth, but closer inspection revealed only reflections in leaves or water droplets. Yet the memory of those glimpses stayed, layering unease atop exhaustion, fear quietly growing in tandem with the jungle's quiet observation. Paths, once thought familiar, began to loop back on themselves. The tourists discovered the same clearing twice in one day, each time with slight differences in the arrangement of fallen branches or rocks. A guide's voice would call across a bend, yet those words never reached their intended ears. Even experienced leaders questioned their memory, asking whether the forest had rearranged itself or whether they had lost their way. The jungle offered subtle nudges, changes so slight they were only noticed in retrospect, leaving humans disoriented and increasingly vulnerable. Glances between group members became furtive. Fear took the shape of hesitation and doubt. Some reported seeing companions frozen mid-step, staring at invisible figures. Others noted movement in the shadows that seemed coordinated yet impossible. Whispers in the foliage appeared to echo human speech but lacked consistency, tourists began avoiding each other at times, feeling as though the forest itself was guiding them along separate paths, testing endurance and perception without revealing intent. Worn and scattered, the artifacts narrate fragments of forgotten tales, offering only partial stories. A water bottle, found days later, rested on a rock, scuffed but untouched otherwise. A backpack lay open, papers fluttering in the breeze, the contents intact yet inexplicable in arrangement. Cameras captured only indistinct shapes, a shadow in a clearing, a ripple across the river, fragments of reflections that could not be linked to any known presence. Each recovered item amplified the mystery, suggesting action but providing no answers. The forest had absorbed activity and spat back fragments that teased comprehension but denied closure. Footsteps became more than mere impressions in mud. They were signs of absence as much as presence. Groups disappeared gradually, leaving behind boots, a hat, and a single sock on the riverbank. Even those who remained could not track companions with certainty. When investigators arrived weeks later, they found empty campsites, trails that ended abruptly in dense undergrowth, and footprints that appeared to double back on themselves as if the earth itself had shifted. Every clue suggested movement, yet every direction contradicted the next, leaving the jungle's story fragmented and impossible to fully reconcile. Nightfall drew the final curtain. The remaining tourists and guides, exhausted and wary, attempted to follow the river downstream, only to find it veering unpredictably. Trees pressed close, roots reaching out like fingers, and the water narrowed in ways that contradicted their maps. Sounds ceased entirely, leaving an oppressive stillness. Only the faint movement of leaves and the occasional glimpse of a shifting shadow remained, evidence that the forest was alive, aware, and unconcerned with human logic. At a secluded bend of the river, the jungle waits silently, as if it has never let anyone leave at all. The island jungle that swallowed an expedition. Landing on the island, the team was struck by its strange stillness. The waves lapped gently against the shore, yet no gulls circled overhead, no wind stirred the trees beyond the sandy beach. The island seemed untouched, a realm separate from the mapped world, yet it carried an undercurrent of vigilance, as if the forest itself knew they had arrived. Explorers set up their camp with optimism, unaware that every choice of path, every step into the undergrowth, would be recorded in ways that no one could later explain. Viewfinder after viewfinder captured ordinary scenes, guides cutting through undergrowth, tents pitched along the river, and meals prepared on the beach. Yet subtle irregularities appeared even in these early images. A branch appeared where none should have been, a figure half glimpsed at the edge of a frame, movements that seemed repeated yet were never actually present. At first, the expedition dismissed these oddities as camera flaws or minor errors in composition, yet the frequency and consistency of anomalies began to unsettle the photographers. Movement became a motif across the images. Leaves shifted in ways that suggested footsteps, but no tracks followed. Reflections in pools of water showed figures where no one stood. One photograph captured a team member leaning over a riverbank, yet in the background another shadowy shape mimicked the exact posture a second later, though no one could have been there. Each photo seemed to layer reality with something else. Slightly off, almost familiar but impossible to identify. Ripples in the water amplified the mystery. Still ponds reflected not just the sky but elongated shapes and fleeting silhouettes that vanished when approached. On film, these ripples sometimes appeared to distort human figures, elongating limbs and splitting bodies into fragments of motion. The team tried to replicate the effect, but every experiment only deepened the strangeness, as if the jungle had its own rules, ones that refused replication or explanation. Canopy views added another layer of unease. Photos taken from higher vantage points revealed clearings that seemed to move subtly between shots. Trees appeared displaced, or the angle of light shifted in ways that contradicted natural observation. Birds perched on branches that would later appear empty in the same frame. Occasionally a figure would appear in a gap between leaves, only to vanish in the next exposure. The jungle, so dense and unyielding, seemed to manipulate perception itself, leaving humans unsure of what they had truly seen. Objects abandoned or dropped began to tell their own story. A notebook lay open to a page filled with hastily sketched shapes. A compass, once functioning, swung wildly. Cameras captured bursts of colour and motion that no one present could have produced. Each piece of equipment became a partial witness, offering fragments of a narrative that refused coherence. Even the simplest tools, the lens cap, a cooking pot, a single boot, suggested movement and presence where no living person remained. Vanishing came gradually. A guide would wander slightly ahead, only to be found hours later in the same spot, disoriented and unable to recall his path. Photographers returned from excursions with rolls of film that were blank, overexposed, or captured only distortion. Eventually, team members disappeared entirely, leaving behind tents, packs, and the ever-watchful camera lenses. No struggle was evident, no signs of panic. It was as though they had stepped into the island itself and were absorbed without resistance. Developing the film after their disappearance revealed images more troubling than anything recorded in the field. Faces blurred into foliage, limbs elongated into the shapes of branches, and figures appeared suspended mid-step in impossible postures. Photographs of the riverbanks showed traces of people walking backwards, yet no footprints were visible. Aerial shots taken from a drone returned warped and partial, suggesting not just absence but transformation, as if the island had remade reality to guard its secrets. Analysis by investigators after the expedition yielded no answers. Experts in photography, geography, and psychology were unable to explain the distortions. Notes left by the missing team were contradictory, mentioning clear skies one moment and sudden storms the next, as if they recorded not the world itself but a shifting perception imposed by the environment. Every recovered image and journal page offered more questions than conclusions, leaving the island's mystery intact and the human mind scrambling for rational explanations that could never suffice. Horizon lines in the last photograph suggested infinity, dense foliage melting into mist. The river curved unpredictably, cliffs appeared where none were charted, and sunlight struck in angles that seemed impossible. There were no bodies, no final campsite, no indication of where or how the expedition ended. Only images, disjointed and incomplete, remained to suggest a sequence of events, hinting at movement and presence, yet ultimately offering nothing conclusive. Beyond the last photograph, the island waits, its truths hidden where no lens can follow. Following Fawcett's ghost. Preparations began long before the team set foot in the Mato Grosso. Maps were scrutinised, supplies checked and rechecked, and routes studied against the sparse notes left by Colonel Percy Fawcett. Each member carried the weight of history as heavily as their equipment, aware that the jungle had swallowed explorers before, and that retracing Fawcett's path meant walking in the shadow of countless vanished footsteps. Even the smallest decisions, how to approach a riverbank, where to pitch camp, felt laden with consequence, as if the forest itself remembered every choice ever made along its winding corridors. Tales told by villagers and local guides carried a quiet urgency. Fawcett's obsession with the city of Z had long been a subject of rumour, a story embroidered with mystery, superstition, and fragments of truth. Some spoke of a man who vanished without a trace, leaving only his journals and sketches. Others hinted at more unsettling possibilities, whispers of a place that did not welcome outsiders, where the river curves concealed danger and the forest shifted for those who dared follow its maze. The modern explorers listened closely, noting every nuance, yet could not know which warnings were caution and which were the residue of imagination. Currents guided the journey in ways both subtle and disorienting. Rivers twisted and widened unexpectedly, trails forked into multiple paths, and landmarks described in Fawcett's maps sometimes appeared inverted or displaced. Even with GPS devices, the men found themselves retracing steps they thought they had already taken, as though the jungle reshaped itself overnight. Streams ran faster than anticipated, cliffs appeared where none were marked, and islands of dense foliage blocked passages that maps had promised were navigable. Mist-shrouded mornings obscured everything beyond a few meters. Sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy, creating an eerie grey haze that blurred the boundary between river and forest, between safety and the unknown. The team's progress slowed as visibility failed, and sounds carried differently. A splash might be a jaguar in the river, or it might be a fallen branch. Every movement was amplified in the silence, and every shadow suggested presence where there was none. Markers left by previous expeditions offered some reassurance, but they also unsettled. Notches carved into trees, faded cairns along ridges, and broken tools half buried in mud hinted that others had come this way and never returned. Some markers were indecipherable, the symbols worn away by time and weather, leaving only the sense that someone or something had recorded their passing. The explorers debated whether to follow these remnants or strike out into uncharted terrain, aware that each decision carried risk. Signals appeared without explanation. A sudden splash in the river, a movement in the undergrowth, the glint of metal in the sun. Each seemed mundane at first, yet each occasion left the team tense and hyper-aware. Radios crackled unexpectedly, carrying static or faint voices that no one recognized. Animals reacted oddly, stopping mid-step or staring in silence before vanishing. The explorers began questioning their own perceptions, uncertain whether the disturbances were natural, imagined, or perhaps traces of history repeating itself in strange echoes. Abandoned campsites emerged deep in the forest. Tents torn and flapping, supplies strewn and rotting, footprints that stopped abruptly. These scenes mirrored those described in Fawcett's own notes. Some items were surprisingly intact: journals half hidden beneath leaves, a rusted knife still embedded in the soil, a cooking pot overgrown with moss. Each discovery reinforced the sense of continuity across time, the eerie feeling that the jungle preserved memory, and that those who vanished once might not have truly left at all. Notations recovered from scattered journals and maps told fragments of stories, hints of hardships endured, directions attempted and abandoned, an occasional frantic commentary about the unknown. Entries overlapped between the original expedition and modern attempts, with some modern notations echoing Fawcett's own words in unexpected ways. These scribbled pages offered no explanations, only a sense of urgency and disorientation, as if the jungle itself had influenced the minds of those who tried to follow its hidden courses. Alignment between past and present became increasingly apparent. The same river bends that Fawcett described were reached by modern explorers in the same sequence. The same unusual rock formations marked points where earlier journals had recorded hesitation or alarm. Even the disappearance of certain supplies or the sudden disorientation of party members seemed to follow a pattern, invisible yet precise. The explorers felt caught in a loop, aware of history shaping their every step, and increasingly uncertain whether the jungle was a place or a force that dictated fate. Periphery views of the canopy revealed little of the larger mystery, only endless green and the occasional glimpse of a winding river. The forest seemed timeless, indifferent, and patient. Every trial, every lost path, every vanished companion reinforced the sense that the jungle had seen this all before, and that human determination alone could not outwit its secrets. Each attempt to reclaim history, to follow in Fawcett's footsteps, left only traces of effort against a backdrop that remained constant and unknowable. Each river crossing and every hidden trail seemed to whisper that history had yet another victim waiting to step into its shadow. The jungle photographer's final frame. Lens in hand, the team moved silently through the dense undergrowth, each step measured to avoid disturbing the wildlife they hoped to capture. Their objective was simple on paper: document rare species and pristine landscapes in a rainforest untouched by human hands. Equipment was meticulously organized, batteries checked, memory cards formatted, and backup cameras carried in waterproof cases. Every shot, every setting, every careful composition reflected both skill and anticipation. Yet beneath the professionalism lurked an unspoken awareness of isolation. The jungle was vast, and its shadows seemed to stretch longer with every passing hour. Canopy light filtered through the towering trees in shifting patterns, illuminating leaves and branches in shifting mosaics. Initial photographs were ordinary, beautiful even, close-ups of orchids, cascading streams and flocks of iridescent birds. The images were crisp, precise and reassuring, a testament to the team's preparation and talent. Yet beneath the beauty there was a subtle tension, as if the forest were aware of being watched. Leaves trembled when no wind stirred, and distant movements caught the lens's eye before they could be confirmed by human observation. Shutter clicks began to reveal anomalies. At first they were minor: a branch that seemed displaced, a bird frozen mid-flight in an impossible position, a shadow that did not match any visible source. The team debated whether it was technique, timing, or fatigue. Still, the images accumulated, each more unsettling than the last, hinting at discrepancies between reality and what the lens recorded. Equipment was checked repeatedly, angles adjusted, yet the distortions persisted, subtle enough to be questioned but insistent enough to be noticed. Focus became a fragile tether to reality. Each shot revealed elements that seemed to shift between exposures, a shadow where none should exist, foliage that appeared subtly rearranged, or reflections in water that did not match the surroundings. Review sessions devolved into tension-filled examinations as team members argued over what was real and what was imagined. Cameras intended to document the jungle instead amplified its mysteries, capturing moments that challenged perception and unsettled even the most experienced eyes. Reflection became inevitable. Photographs displayed faint figures or fleeting movements that no one could explain. A flash of pale skin among dense vines, a shadow that mimicked human form, a sudden blur in the background. Each image suggested presence, absence, or perhaps both. The team began reviewing shots immediately after taking them, comparing each frame with previous ones, attempting to reconcile the images with what they had actually seen. With each comparison, unease grew, and the forest seemed to close in, silent yet almost sentient. Whispering conversations replaced casual commentary. The team spoke in lower tones, questioning each other's recollections and the validity of the photographs. Arguments erupted over whether a figure in the background was an animal, a person, or an optical illusion. Nights became restless, sleep fractured by imagined movements or the sound of branches snapping in the distance. Isolation compounded uncertainty, leaving each photographer unsure of what had truly occurred or what had been captured on film. Exposure increased their anxiety. A camera left momentarily unattended returned with images they swore had not been taken. Birds perched in one frame vanished in the next, only to appear again in impossible locations. The team's journals reflected mounting tension, noting discrepancies between memory and captured images, the sense that the forest played with perception, and a growing fear that they were being watched by forces beyond comprehension. The lens, once a tool for documentation, had become a mirror reflecting uncertainty and dread. Tripod and camera bags were discovered abandoned along narrow trails, half covered by leaves and mud. These silent remnants told of hasty movements, vanished footsteps, and the collapse of routine. No signs indicated struggle or violence, yet the evidence of sudden departure was undeniable. Every piece of equipment left behind seemed to reinforce the notion that the jungle had observed, perhaps even guided, the team's final movements, leaving only questions where answers should have been. Negative and digital files recovered later offered more questions than resolutions. Each image was examined in detail, magnified and compared. Faces appeared where none had been present, shadows stretched beyond plausible angles, and small details seemed to change subtly from one frame to the next. Analysts debated technical errors, hallucinations, or deliberate tampering, but no satisfactory explanation emerged. The photographs documented events that no one could fully account for, capturing the unexplained in the midst of the ordinary. Focus became a desperate attempt to understand the incomprehensible. The final frames suggested movement just beyond perception, as though something or someone had passed through these viewfinder at the exact moment the shutter fired. The team's notes indicated repeated attempts to recapture certain angles, only to find the results inconsistent or incomplete. Even their most careful compositions could not control what the jungle recorded, leaving behind a record that was partial, disorienting and haunting. Darkroom reflections, whether literal or imagined, left the forest mystery intact. Every recovered image was examined, yet each seemed to raise further questions. The jungle's canopy, the shifting light, the fleeting wildlife, and the occasional anomaly combined to create a narrative that resisted comprehension. Humans had entered this green labyrinth to observe and document, but the lens betrayed them with glimpses of the unknown, leaving their story incomplete and their fate unresolved. The camera remains, its final frame frozen in the moment before the forest claimed them, a question no one can answer. The gold hunters of the Green Inferno. Expedition members arrived at the remote jungle valley with optimism that glimmered like the metal they sought. The river snaked through thick foliage, promising both access and isolation. Their boats were unloaded under the relentless sun, tents pitched among the damp undergrowth, and equipment carried over routes slick with rain. The forest seemed indifferent, a silent observer of human ambition. its canopy holding shadows that shifted with the wind. From the first step, the jungle swallowed the ordinary sounds of their arrival, replacing them with a quiet that pressed on the mind as much as the heat pressed on their bodies. Creeks wound through the valley like silver threads, their currents strong and unpredictable. Prospectors waded through them, carrying pans and pickaxes, measuring the riverbeds for flecks of gold. The water was shallow but treacherous. One wrong step could plunge a man into the swirling undercurrents. The men joked to mask unease, but whispers of danger travelled faster than laughter. Branches scratched exposed arms, mud seeped into boots, and the jungle seemed to close around them with each hesitant step forward. Prospectors began to reveal themselves beyond their physical toil. Names, ages, and past exploits were shared around campfires, yet ambition coloured each story. Eyes lingered on others' finds, hands trembled slightly when someone unearthed a promising vein, and quiet calculations were made of how much gold each might claim. Among them, alliances formed and dissolved with subtle shifts in posture and expression. Greed was a living presence, amplifying minor slights into deep resentments, and the jungle listened, silent but all-seeing. Claims were staked and boundaries set, yet disagreements soon arose. A promising deposit triggered arguments over ownership and method. Maps were scrutinized, then discarded, then redrawn in heated sketches on the forest floor. The men spent hours squabbling over measurements and directions, their voices rising as the day wore on, echoing off the steep ridges and dense foliage. What had begun as camaraderie now teetered on suspicion, with each discovery adding weight to unspoken fears that someone might take more than their share. Heat pressed down relentlessly, sweat trickling into eyes, and clothing clinging to skin. Nights offered no relief. Humid air refused sleep, and insects found every patch of exposed flesh. Fatigue blurred perception, turning harmless movements into threats, the rustle of leaves into ominous signs. Some men reported hearing footsteps when they were alone, or voices carried on the wind that seemed to echo accusations. Even the most level-headed began to doubt their senses, wondering if the jungle itself was conspiring to confuse and unsettle them. Obsession gripped the prospectors with an almost tactile force. Maps that had once been guides became talismans, each creek and ridge obsessively measured for hidden veins of gold. Arguments erupted over claims and landmarks, while some men ventured alone into dense foliage, returning hours later with wild eyes and muttered stories of strange lights or sounds that had guided them deeper. The fever of avarice mingled with the oppressive humidity, producing a delirium that blurred the line between ambition and madness, and the forest seemed to feed on it. Doubt took root quietly, then spread. Men checked each other's packs, questioned intentions, and whispered behind backs. Simple mistakes were met with suspicion, friendly gestures with resentment. A dropped tool became evidence of betrayal, a late return from the river a sign of plotting. With every misstep, paranoia grew, infecting even those who had arrived confident and composed. The forest's stillness magnified each fear, and isolation ensured there was no respite from the pressure. Violence followed naturally, inevitable as the sun rising over the canopy. Arguments spilled into shouts, then into blows. One prospector disappeared after a scuffle, leaving only a trail of blood and a discarded pickaxe. Another was found days later, his body partially concealed beneath foliage, eyes wide with terror. Men turned on each other in moments of rage or suspicion, until few remained unscathed. Each death, each disappearance, fed the fears of the survivors, who began to question not just each other but their own minds. Notes recovered from abandoned campsites offered only glimpses into the unravelling minds of the men. Pages described strange movements in the jungle, visions of companions where none existed, and dreams of gold that turned to ash before grasp. The handwriting grew erratic, the sentences broken, reflecting minds frayed by heat, hunger, and the corrosive effect of avarice. Investigators would later puzzle over these notes, finding hints of conflict, hallucination, and despair, but no coherent narrative to explain the full extent of what transpired. Every remaining artifact seemed to hint at a larger truth, revealing only fragments of the story. Rusted pans, a shattered tent frame, a gold pan streaked with blood. Each item was a testament to ambition turned fatal. Footprints led in circles, or disappeared entirely, leaving only mud and leaf litter. Maps were torn, scribbled over and left to decay. Tools lay abandoned, some clean, some bent, as though dropped in panic. Each item whispered of human folly, yet provided no clarity, leaving the jungle as the only constant witness. Where the valley once rang with voices and laughter, now only wind and far-off bird calls disturbed the silence. The river flowed as before, indifferent to the lives consumed along its banks. Gold flecks still glimmered in the sun, waiting for the next intruders who might tempt fate. The forest held the story in fragments, as it had for generations, silent and exacting, watching ambition turn to madness and greed to ruin. Among the twisting rivers and hidden ravines, the jungle kept tally of those consumed by their own ambition. The expedition that returned broken. Emergence from the dense rainforest was both sudden and surreal. A handful of figures stumbled into the open, their clothing tattered, skin blistered, and eyes wide with exhaustion. Their movements were hesitant, as though the very act of stepping onto firm ground demanded unfamiliar strength. Local guides watched silently, uncertain whether to offer assistance or simply stand back, sensing the weight of experiences these survivors carried, heavy enough to bend the light around them. Memories came in fragments, as though the jungle had stripped them of coherence. Each survivor recalled events differently. One spoke of a river that twisted impossibly, another described a cliff that had never existed on the maps, and a third insisted that the forest seemed alive, guiding some, consuming others. Conversations often faltered, sentences trailing into silence, each mind attempting to reconstruct a story that refused to form a complete picture. Tracks told a story the survivors could not. Footprints faded into mud, broken branches marked passage, and hastily abandoned supplies hinted at moments of panic or exhaustion. Occasionally, a discarded pack or snapped pole suggested decisions made in urgency, but the reasons behind them remained unknowable. The jungle had recorded their journey in subtle ways, leaving a trail of tantalizingly incomplete clues. Faltering bodies mirrored faltering minds. Night brought restless tossing, nightmares of shifting shadows, and sudden awakenings drenched in sweat. The survivors' senses seemed heightened and yet unreliable, every distant rustle or flash of light carrying the weight of imagined threat. Meals were half-eaten, conversations stilted, and laughter absent. Each step forward demanded effort that had nothing to do with terrain and everything to do with the quiet erosion of will. Glimpses of vanished companions haunted the survivors even in daylight. Shadows among the trees, fleeting movements along the riverbank, and the distant call of birds seemed to mimic human presence. Some swore they saw figures they recognized, only to discover space moments later. These visions blurred the line between reality and memory, reinforcing the sense that the forest retained a consciousness of its own, one that recorded passage yet offered no clarity. Echoes lingered in the mind long after the forest had faded from sight. Sounds of rushing water, cracking branches, and indistinct calls seemed to repeat in internal dialogue, replayed with the vividness of memory yet unconfirmed by others. Survivors questioned their own perceptions, unsure which moments had truly occurred and which had been conjured by exhaustion or fear. The line between recollection and hallucination blurred with every retelling. Remnants of the expedition told partial truths. A water bottle, scorched tent fabric, and a single rusted compass were recovered along the path they had taken. Maps were torn and annotated in haste, some sections missing entirely, others marked with indecipherable symbols. The physical evidence offered only fragments of explanation, suggesting movement and decision without revealing motive or outcome. Each object carried the silence of those who had left it behind. Tensions surfaced between the survivors themselves. Blame, frustration, and grief coexisted in small volatile moments, a misremembered direction, an unspoken accusation, or an argument over whether to continue retracing steps. Bonds formed in the early stages of the expedition frayed quickly, replaced by suspicion and the subtle erosion of trust. The shared trauma became a delicate, brittle framework upon which each person relied, yet any misstep threatened collapse. Recollections taken from hurried journals and sporadic audio logs offered only partial insight. Scribbled notes mentioned lost supplies, disorientation at river forks, and the inexplicable disappearance of companions. Audio captured breathless voices, fragments of arguments, and occasional panic, but without context or clarity. Each recovered piece hinted at a larger narrative, yet the full story remained stubbornly out of reach, as though the jungle had deliberately obscured it. Edges of perception continued to fray as the survivors attempted to explain themselves. The forest had left traces not only on the landscape, but on the mind, bending memory, distorting chronology, and injecting doubt into every recollection. Moments that should have been clear were recalled inconsistently. Familiar landmarks appeared altered. Decisions that seemed rational at the time were now recounted as instinctive, desperate, or irrational. The boundaries of reality and memory had been softened by the intensity of experience. Labyrinths of dense vegetation and sudden ravines had forced choices the survivors could barely explain. Paths once thought safe twisted back upon themselves, leaving them disoriented and trapped in familiar yet alien terrain. Occasionally, natural formations created impossible angles, as if the forest itself sought to confuse or redirect them. Even with compasses and maps, they could not escape the feeling that the jungle had orchestrated each step, controlling progress and misfortune with silent precision. The aftermath was both physical and psychological. Though the survivors had returned to civilization, the jungle's presence remained imprinted on their bodies and minds. Eyes darted at movement, hands hesitated to touch unfamiliar objects, and sleep came only intermittently, haunted by glimpses of rivers, cliffs, and shadows that may or may not have existed. Attempts to recount the expedition were met with incredulity. Every survivor's account differed, leaving observers with fragments of truth wrapped in confusion and uncertainty. The jungle kept its silence, indifferent to the broken minds it had released back into the world. The forbidden territory of the uncontacted. Boundaries were clearly marked on maps, yet they offered no true measure of the territory beyond. Official records labelled it off-limits, a stretch of rainforest untouched by modern civilization. For the expedition team, this designation carried a dual thrill and dread, the promise of discovery and the undeniable weight of intrusion. Preparations were meticulous, every ration, compass and survival tool accounted for, but anticipation could not quiet the sense that the forest itself was a vigilant presence. Warnings had been issued repeatedly by local guides and indigenous intermediaries. Tales of sudden vanishings, unexplainable disturbances, and spirits guarding these lands were delivered with solemn faces. Some of the guides refused outright to proceed beyond certain points, insisting that crossing into the unknown was more than mere risk, it was a transgression. The explorers noted these cautions but pressed on, drawn by the allure of untouched wilderness and the possibility of witnessing life unseen by outsiders. Verdure pressed in from every side, overwhelming the senses. Trees arched impossibly high, their roots twisted like serpents through thick undergrowth. The air was heavy with humidity and the scent of damp earth, while distant bird calls and animal cries created a symphony that was both beautiful and alien. Every step demanded careful navigation over slippery moss and hidden roots, yet the forest seemed to shift subtly with each hour, paths narrowing or opening unpredictably. Impressions of prior human presence emerged almost imperceptibly. A cleared patch here, an arrangement of sticks there, tools fashioned from bone or wood tucked beneath foliage. These traces were fleeting, easily missed, and never repeated consistently, as though the forest allowed glimpses but refused confirmation. The team debated whether they were encountering remnants of past visitors or deliberate signs left by inhabitants, yet no one ever glimpsed a face or a figure. Silhouettes of movement flickered at the edge of vision, never fully formed yet undeniably present. Shadows darted behind thick foliage, glimpses of figures that vanished before the explorers could focus. The uncertainty gnawed at them. Every instinct screamed that they were not alone, yet no sound, shape, or trace confirmed presence. The forest seemed to protect its inhabitants, allowing only fleeting hints of life while preserving an invisible barrier that refused intrusion. Disorientation grew quickly. Streams flowed in unexpected directions. Small hills appeared where none had been noted, and trails that seemed familiar twisted back upon themselves. Even with GPS and compasses, navigation was unreliable. Every attempt to mark their progress was undone by the forest's relentless complexity. The explorers' sense of direction became unmoored, as though the forest were actively erasing their passage. Stillness settled in intervals that felt unnatural, a heavy pause in the otherwise constant hum of insects and distant wildlife. Birds went silent, wind dropped, and even the undergrowth seemed to hold its breath. The team moved cautiously, aware that such pauses could conceal observation or impending danger. Each sudden return of movement or sound reinforced the impression that the forest was not merely a setting but an active force, responding to their presence in ways they could neither anticipate nor control. Instincts sharpened, warning of unseen observation. Every rustle of leaves, sudden cracking of branches, or fleeting glimpse of movement heightened alertness. Some felt eyes upon them where none could exist. The weight of being watched without seeing the watcher created tension that seeped into sleep and conversation alike. Decision-making became cautious and hesitant, every choice shadowed by the possibility of error or provocation. Traces of the uncontacted people became more enigmatic as the team advanced. Handmade implements, shallow shelters camouflaged by vegetation, and occasional carved symbols suggested intelligence and planning. Nothing indicated hostility, yet the absence of direct contact left the explorers unsettled. Each artifact hinted at a culture both present and absent, visible yet intangible, reinforcing the sense that the territory was alive with vigilant guardianship. Fleeting signs of human presence emerged, carefully arranged stones, faint smoke trails curling from hidden clearings, and temporary shelters nearly invisible beneath the dense foliage. The team debated their significance, unsure if they were deliberate warnings, signs of daily life, or protective measures to obscure activity. Each discovery reinforced the forest's dual nature, inviting exploration yet enforcing boundaries with quiet authority, leaving the explorers aware that intrusion was neither welcomed nor fully understood. Conflicts arose among the team, debate over how far to proceed, whether to mark or disturb traces, and how to document findings escalated into arguments. Some argued for immediate retreat, citing both ethical and personal safety concerns, while others pressed on, unwilling to leave without evidence of discovery. The forest amplified these tensions, isolating the individuals with shadows, shifting terrain, and the pressure of their own conscience. Departure became abrupt and uneasy. One morning, after a night of relentless rain, the team noticed paths they had taken no longer aligned with memory or instruments. Landmarks vanished, streams had shifted, previously navigable ground became impassable. Fearing permanent disorientation, the expedition decided to retreat. Yet even in retreat the forest resisted, erasing evidence of passage, absorbing all traces into its dense expanse. Absence was the only certainty left behind. Campsites were reclaimed by roots and foliage, footprints vanished in mud, and the subtle signals of life that had indicated previous human presence disappeared as if never made. Reports, journals, and maps later recovered offered tantalizing hints but never the full story. No one could account for every decision, every step, or every vanished hour spent deep within the uncontacted territory. The forest had maintained its secrecy, leaving the explorers' curiosity unresolved. The forest swallowed their trail, leaving only silence where curiosity had trespassed. The modern crossing that ended in madness. Launch of the expedition was celebrated with meticulous planning and precise coordination. Every member of the team carried state-of-the-art GPS devices, satellite phones, and weather monitors, their packs filled with emergency rations, medical kits, and survival tools designed for even the harshest conditions. Riverboats were tested, drones calibrated, and every contingency rehearsed, as though every possible hazard could be anticipated and contained. Yet beneath the veneer of preparation, an unspoken tension lingered, a quiet acknowledgement that no technology could tame the relentless vastness of the jungle. Confidence remained high during the initial hours. The trail appeared navigable, maps aligned with reality, and the forest seemed, if not welcoming, at least predictable. The team moved with purpose, documenting progress, photographing wildlife, and logging coordinates. Laughter occasionally cut through the humidity, reinforcing the sense that their training and technology provided immunity from the forest's ancient unpredictability. Each member believed that modern tools could bridge the gap between civilization and untamed wilderness, but the first subtle signs of challenge would soon undermine that certainty. Malfunctions began subtly. A compass wavered, then a GPS marker blinked out entirely, and radio channels returned only static when voices should have connected. Initial frustration gave way to unease as each failure compounded the next, eroding confidence. Devices designed to guarantee safety now seemed unreliable, betraying the explorers at every turn. Nightly recalibrations became futile as signals disappeared inexplicably, leaving them to navigate by instinct, memory, and the dimming light of dawn. Storms struck without warning, unpredictable in intensity and duration. Torrential rain transformed narrow trails into rivers of mud, and swollen creeks surged across the paths, forcing risky crossings. Fallen trees blocked progress, and the humidity, already oppressive, seemed to press heavier against skin and lungs. Protective gear failed to keep the team dry, while the thick canopy above trapped the heat. Each misstep amplified exhaustion, and every attempt to regain footing reminded the team that the forest, despite modern technology, remained untamed and indifferent. Friction emerged as stress mounted. Disagreements over direction, pace, and risk escalated into heated arguments. Some urged retreat, citing failing equipment, diminishing morale, and mental strain, while others insisted on pressing forward, unwilling to abandon months of planning and expense. Minor irritations magnified into rifts, and distrust simmered beneath surface interactions. Even the most cohesive teams began to fracture, their collective discipline eroded by fatigue, isolation, and the relentless pressure of a jungle that refused compromise. Visions began to haunt the exhausted. Shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, and fleeting forms appeared among the foliage, vanishing whenever approached. Night brought whispers carried by the wind, indistinct but chilling, seeming to speak of their inadequacy and trespass. Some reported hearing footsteps behind them, though the path remained empty. Fatigue warped perception, turning harmless sounds into threats and amplifying fear. Rationality slipped, replaced by a constant gnawing sense that unseen eyes were tracking every movement. Seclusion deepened the psychological strain. Despite satellite phones and GPS devices, the team felt profoundly isolated, cut off by the jungle's interference. Every choice carried weighty consequences, each decision shadowed by doubt. The forest closed in from all sides, compressing space and time, twisting familiar landmarks into unrecognizable forms. Even the most seasoned explorers began to question their own memories, unsure whether paths were real or imagined, whether movement was forward or simply a rotation in place. Collapse followed in subtle stages. Irritability, paranoia, and confusion escalated among the group. Sleep became nearly impossible as humidity pressed against skin and insects fed incessantly. Hallucinations appeared, sometimes brief, sustained, leading team members to mistrust their own senses. Rational thought eroded under pressure, leaving decisions guided by instinct, fear, and exhaustion. Alliances fractured, and the sense of safety that modern technology promised disintegrated entirely. Markings left along the trail, broken branches, trampled undergrowth, and disturbed soil offered cryptic evidence of passage. Some seemed to indicate progress, while others suggested the forest itself had altered the path. Paths that had been carefully recorded now appeared shifted or erased, as though nature sought to obscure all evidence of human intrusion. Each anomaly heightened tension, suggesting a presence beyond observation, or a deliberate manipulation by the environment itself. Additional hazards compounded the struggle. Insects swarmed relentlessly, bringing infection and discomfort. Poisonous plants and hidden roots caused injuries that slowed progress, while venomous snakes and startled wildlife created sudden dangers. Streams swelled unpredictably, carrying away supplies or cutting off retreat. Even minor injuries became serious, and the cumulative toll of heat, fatigue, and fear began to outweigh the team's technical preparation, revealing the limits of human endurance against an environment unyielding to modern methods. Dissolution marked the final phase. The team fragmented, with some straying from the trail, others collapsing under heat and dehydration, and the remainder unable to maintain direction. Days blurred together, and those who later emerged could recount only fragmented sequences, missing companions, impossible terrain, and moments when reality seemed to warp. Satellite images captured gaps in their intended path, leaving researchers to speculate about the events that transpired. The jungle, indifferent yet all-encompassing, offered no answers, only the enduring mystery of what had occurred in its depths. The wilderness claimed them completely, leaving only questions that could never be answered.